The order came before she even touched the rifle. "Take it away from her." Lieutenant Ethan Voss said it the way you'd say, "Get that dog off my porch." Flat, final, not worth explaining. Natalie Brooks stood in the center of the briefing room at Fort Granite, 12 pairs of eyes sliding away from her like she was something embarrassing. She had the highest marksmanship score in the battalion. She had 3 years of mountain patrol experience. She had already identified an enemy pattern that nobody else had caught. None of that mattered to Voss, because she wasn't what he expected a shooter to look like. And 9 days later, when 12 soldiers were one breath away from dying on a ridge in the middle of nowhere, the only thing standing between them and a mortar round was the woman nobody wanted there. If this story grips you, stay with me until the very end. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The briefing room at Forward Operating Base Granite smelled like burnt coffee and boot rubber, and the particular kind of male tension that never fully left a room even after the men cleared out. It was a smell Natalie Brooks had spent 3 years learning to ignore, the same way she'd learned to ignore a lot of things. She was standing near the back wall when Voss walked in. She heard him before she saw him. The deliberate weight of his footsteps, the way he moved through a room like he was already annoyed at everything in it. Captain Ethan Voss was 34 years old, West Point educated, and had the kind of jaw that photographers loved and subordinates quietly hated. He came with a reputation built on 2 deployments to Iraq, a collection of commendations that his superiors found impressive, and a management philosophy that could be summarized in roughly 4 words: my way or paperwork. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved across the room in the automatic scan of a man who had done too many briefings, clipboard, whiteboard, soldiers, and then landed on Natalie. The scan stopped. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, maybe less, but every person in the room felt it. "Whose rifle is that?" he said. Natalie didn't look up from the topographic map she was reviewing. "Mine, sir." "Your assigned weapon is an M4. I've been the battalion's designated marksman for 14 months, sir. The M110 is my assigned weapon." A pause. Not long enough to be dramatic, long enough to mean something. "Take that rifle away from her." The words landed in the room like a dropped tray in a mess hall. Sudden, flat, impossible to pretend you hadn't heard. Sergeant First Class Caleb Turner, seated 2 chairs down from Natalie, set his pen on the table very slowly. Turner was 41 and built like a man who had been assembled from spare parts. Long arms, a neck like a tree trunk, eyes the color of old creek water. He had 19 years in the Army and the kind of stillness that made lieutenants instinctively lower their voices around him. "Sir," Turner said very carefully, "Staff Sergeant Brooks holds the battalion qualification record at 1,100 meters. She's the reason we still have a coherent Overwatch doctrine after Rodriguez got medevaced in." "I know what her file says, Sergeant." "Then you know the rifle stays with her, sir." Voss looked at Turner, the way you look at a GPS that's routing you somewhere wrong, irritated but not yet willing to throw it out the window. "I'll review the assignment," he said. "In the meantime, Brooks, you're on standard patrol rotation." He walked to the front of the room and picked up a dry erase marker and began drawing grid lines like the previous 30 seconds hadn't happened. Natalie finally looked up from the map. She didn't say anything. She had learned very early that arguing with men like Voss in front of witnesses was a trap. You either looked insubordinate or you looked emotional, and either way you lost ground. So she watched him draw his grid lines and she committed the shape of his thinking to memory, the same way she'd committed the shape of every valley around FOB Granite, carefully, without judgment, because information was always more useful than anger. Specialist Leo Ramirez slid into the chair beside her 20 minutes later, during the break between briefing blocks. He was 22, from Albuquerque, with a habit of chewing the end of his stylus when he was nervous. He was nervous a lot. "That was messed up," he murmured. "Write down the grid coordinates he marked for Sector 7, Natalie said. "He went over them too fast." "Did you hear what I said?" "I heard you." "Write down the coordinates, Ramirez." He wrote them down. But he kept glancing at her sideways, waiting for something, a reaction, a crack in the surface, some signal that she was as rattled as he was. Natalie didn't give him one, not because she wasn't rattled. She had been in the Army long enough to know that rattled was a luxury, and right now she couldn't afford it. Instead, she looked at the grid coordinates Ramirez had copied, and thought about the terrain in Sector 7, the way the western ridge curved sharply before dropping into Blackstone Valley, the supply trail that cut through the low ground, the natural choke points where a patient enemy unit could establish position without being visible from any standard patrol angle. She had been thinking about Sector 7 for 6 days. Natalie Brooks had not grown up wanting to be a soldier. She'd grown up in Harlan County in the eastern Kentucky mountains, in a 3-bedroom house wedged between a creek and a coal road, where the noise of the world came in 2 flavors: heavy machinery and total silence. Her father had been a hunting guide before his knees gave out. Her mother taught school and kept a garden, and had strong opinions about both the governor of Kentucky and the proper way to can green beans. Natalie had spent her childhood learning to move quietly through terrain, reading weather from the color of clouds, understanding that patience was not passivity, it was a form of preparation. She'd enlisted at 22, a year out of community college with an associate's degree in applied mathematics and no particular plan for what came next. The marksmanship aptitude scores had come back high enough that her recruiting sergeant had read them twice. She'd completed advanced individual training and then sniper school, the first woman in her cohort to do so, and had spent the subsequent years accumulating a record that read, on paper, like a straightforward success story. In practice, it was more complicated. There was always a Voss somewhere in the chain, not always by name, not always even consciously hostile. Just men who looked at the roster, saw her name, and had a moment of visible recalibration, a slight reset of expectations, a fraction of hesitation before they handed her a responsibility they'd have handed without thought to anyone else. She had learned to recognize the look. She had also learned that the only durable response to it was to do the work until the work was undeniable. The rifle helped. The M110 semi-automatic sniper system was not a forgiving weapon. It demanded consistency, in grip, in breathing, in the understanding of ballistic variables that changed with every shift in altitude or humidity or wind. Natalie had put more rounds through her particular M110 than anyone in the battalion. She knew its trigger brake the way a pianist knows the weight of specific keys. When she was behind the scope, the world condensed to a small, manageable circle of clarity. And for those moments, the look on Voss's face and the ambient noise of other people's discomfort became genuinely irrelevant. She had learned to live in that circle, but she couldn't live there during briefings. The third morning after Voss arrived, Natalie went to find Turner. She caught him in the motor pool, crouched beside a Humvee with a flashlight and a look of professional suffering on his face, trying to diagnose an oil pressure issue that had been misdiagnosed twice already. "He put it in writing," she said. Turner didn't look up. "The weapon assignment? Standard patrol rotation. M4, no Overwatch designation. I'll push back up the chain. I already filed a formal objection. Captain Halloway's office acknowledged receipt." Turner sat back on his heels and clicked off the flashlight. In the thin morning light, with the oil on his hands and the creases around his eyes from years of squinting into distant terrain, he looked like a man who had run out of surprises. "Brooks," he said, "what do you actually want me to tell you? I want you to tell me if it's worth fighting right now." You know the answer to that. She did. The answer was, not yet. The answer was, pick the hill you die on carefully and make sure it's the right one. The answer was that Voss had 4 months left on his rotation, and she had her record, and her record was going to outlast both of them. "There's something else," she said. Turner waited. "I've been tracking movement patterns in Sector 7, supply trail near the western ridge. Something's changed in the last week. Not the volume of traffic, the pattern of it. Short interval movement, multiple personnel, different spacing than a standard resupply team." Turner's eyes went slightly more focused. He'd been doing this long enough to know what that particular category of observation meant, coming from Natalie Brooks. "How confident are you?" "Confident enough to be worried. Not confident enough to put a number on it yet. I need 2 more days of observation data." "You taking this to Voss?" She looked at him. He nodded slowly. "Take it to me first. We'll build the picture together and then take it to him with the documentation already in place." "He'll still dismiss it." "Probably. But then it's on record that he dismissed it." Turner picked up the flashlight again. "That matters." You understand why that matters? Natalie understood. The observation post that overlooked Sector 7's western approach was a miserable piece of real estate. It sat on a shelf of rock about 40 meters below the ridgeline, exposed on three sides to wind that came down off the upper peaks with the kind of personal hostility that made meteorology feel like combat. The only structure was a sandbag wall that someone in a previous rotation had built at roughly the right height to block wind from your knees, while leaving everything above your waist completely unprotected. Natalie had been spending her pre-dawn hours here for 8 days. She lay in the prone position with her scope trained on the tree line below the supply trail, a notepad beside her elbow, and cataloged movement the way her father had once cataloged deer sign. Not individual moments, but patterns. The frequency of foot traffic, the sequence in which it appeared, the way certain individuals moved versus the way others moved, the behavioral grammar of a unit that was doing something routine versus something purposeful. On the 9th morning, the grammar changed. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't watching for it. Two men moving in a different sequence than the previous days, equipment that shifted position between dawn and full light, a line of sight toward the valley floor that wasn't consistent with the supply team. Natalie ran the calculation. Elevation, wind, distance, probable target angle. She ran it again. Then she wrote the number down in her notebook and stared at it for a moment and felt something cold settle in the center of her chest. She packed her scope and walked back to the FOB. The evening briefing was held in the same fluorescent-lit room that smelled like burnt coffee. Voss stood at the front with his markers and his grid lines. 8 soldiers around the table, body armor off, the particular slumped exhaustion of men who had been in the field for most of the previous 48 hours. Natalie waited for the right moment. Then she set her notebook on the table. "Sir, I need to flag something about Sector 7. Voss didn't look up from the map. Brooks. I've been tracking a movement anomaly on the Western Supply approach. 9 days of observation data. The pattern is consistent with a mortar team establishing a forward position. The probable engagement line, Brooks." He said her name again, and this time he looked up, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite dismissal. It was something more specifically targeted than that. It was the look of a man who had already decided what category you belonged in and found it mildly tedious that you kept trying to climb out of it. "Are you currently assigned to observation duties in Sector 7? A beat. "No, sir." "Then who authorized the observation?" "I was conducting personal operations aren't part of the mission profile." "Sir, the data follow mission parameters." He said it the way you'd say meeting adjourned, clear and without weight, because the weight had never been given to the discussion in the first place. Around the table, eyes moved carefully to the neutral middle distance. Turner's jaw was tight. Ramirez had stopped chewing his stylus. Nobody said anything. Natalie picked up her notebook. "Yes, sir," she said. She sat down and kept her face still and breathed slowly through her nose, and under the table, out of sight, she opened the notebook to the page with the calculation on it and looked at the number again. It had not gotten smaller. "Why do you keep doing it?" Ramirez caught her outside the briefing room, falling into step beside her in that slightly anxious way he had, like he was worried she'd tell him to go away, but also worried she wouldn't. She kept walking. "Doing what?" "Preparing. For a threat that he basically told you doesn't exist. You were out there again at 4 in the morning. I heard you leave." Natalie thought about how to answer that. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer was the kind of thing that sounded simple and was actually not simple at all. "Think about what happens in both scenarios," she said finally. "I prepare. The threat doesn't materialize. Nothing happens. I prepare. The threat does materialize. People are alive who wouldn't be otherwise." She paused. "Now take me out of the equation. The threat materializes. Nobody prepared." Ramirez was quiet for a moment. "So you're preparing because the math works out the same way, regardless of whether Voss agrees with it." She stopped walking and looked at him. He was young enough that this kind of reasoning still seemed slightly extraordinary to him, like she was describing a superpower rather than just arithmetic. "If I'm wrong, nothing happens. If I'm right and I'm not ready, people die." "But what if—" "Ramirez," she said it gently, "get some sleep. We're on a 0530 rotation tomorrow." He nodded and went. She watched him go and then turned back toward the supply tent where she kept her cleaning kit, because the rifle needed to be cleaned, and the ballistic tables for 1,800 meters in high-altitude wind conditions needed to be reviewed. And there was a very specific calculation she needed to run 3 more times until she was certain of the variables. The valley was dark and cold and quiet. She went to work. Over the next 4 days, Natalie did the following things, none of which were authorized, all of which were necessary. She mapped the precise topography of the Western Ridge approach, using satellite imagery and her own direct observation notes, identifying 3 possible mortar placement positions based on sightline, cover, and access route. She calculated the engagement envelope for each position, the probable target area, the maximum effective range, the angular adjustments required based on wind at different times of day. She shot 500 rounds at distances between 1,400 and 1,900 meters on the FOB's back range during early morning hours when the range was officially unoccupied, adjusting her technique until the groupings were consistent enough that the variation was purely ballistic rather than procedural. She also filed 2 more formal assessments with Turner, both of which Turner forwarded up the chain, both of which came back with a notation from Voss. Within mission parameters, no action indicated. Turner showed her the notations one evening, spreading both papers on the table between them without editorial comment. Natalie studied them for a moment. "He's documenting his own dismissals," she said. "Yes. Which means he's either extremely confident he's right, or he doesn't believe he'll ever be in a position to need to explain them." Turner folded the papers and put them in his field notebook. "I talked to Captain Halloway directly. Off the record. She's watching." "Watching isn't helping." "No," Turner agreed. "It's not." He looked at her across the table with those old Creekwater eyes. "Brooks, how certain are you?" She thought about the number in her notebook. "Certain enough that I went through my own personal supply of match-grade ammunition." Turner was quiet for a long time. "All right," he said finally, quietly. "Then we do this the right way. You keep observing. I'll make sure the radio assignments for the next patrol put you on Overwatch communication. If something happens, I want you in a position to respond. Voss won't authorize. Voss authorizes the general patrol structure. The specific position assignments within Overwatch come through me." A pause. "That's not a workaround. That's the actual chain of command." Natalie looked at him. "You could get in trouble for this." "I've been in trouble before." He said it simply, without drama, the way you state a well-established biographical fact. "Go clean your rifle, Ed." The night before the patrol to the Western Ridge, Natalie sat on the sandbag wall of the observation post in full darkness and ran through every variable she had cataloged. Wind at 0600, approximately 8 kilometers per hour from the northwest, consistent with the last 11 days. Altitude differential between the probable enemy position and any engagement angle from the ridge, approximately 40 meters. Distance to target, 1,850 meters at maximum probability. Could be as close as 1,750 if the positioning had shifted, which it might have. Bullet flight time at that distance in these conditions, approximately 2.9 seconds. Adjustments required from standard 0, significant. Specific, committed to memory. She had fired the exact firing solution at 1,850 meters 4 times in the last 3 days. The groups were tight. The technique was repeatable. She thought about Voss's briefings, the way he moved through the room, the particular confidence of a man who was never quite wrong, just insufficiently advised. She didn't hate him. Hatred was a waste of calibration. She had spent too long understanding exactly why certain men looked at her and decided she was a category rather than a person. And the mechanism wasn't hatred, it was simply absence, an absence of imagination. The inability to look at something unfamiliar and allow it to be capable. She thought about Ramirez, sleeping 2 buildings away, 22 years old, from Albuquerque, who chewed his stylus and asked too many questions and had never once looked at her the way Voss looked at her. She thought about tomorrow. She took the rifle apart in the dark, cleaned it, reassembled it, verified function by touch, and then set it beside her and sat in the cold mountain wind and listened to the valley below, where something was being prepared. They left before sunrise. 12 soldiers on a standard reconnaissance patrol. That was how it was logged. Sector 7, western approach, scheduled movement to the ridge observation point for a 6-hour position. Turner had arranged the position assignments exactly as he'd said. Natalie was designated overwatch support on the eastern edge of the patrol formation, which, when they reached the ridge, would put her at an angle with a line of sight to the western approach. Not the primary observation point, but close enough. Voss was not on the patrol. He was back at the FOB managing the daily logistics brief. The climb took 90 minutes. The mountain didn't care about schedules. Loose rock, switchback trails that had been worn down by decades of shepherds, and more recently by American boots, and more recently than that by people who did not want American boots there. The air thinned noticeably above 2,400 meters. Ramirez breathed in short, controlled bursts beside her on the steeper sections, which meant he was managing it correctly. The 2 scouts at the front of the formation moved steadily, checking ground with every step. When they reached the ridge shelf, the valley opened below them. Natalie had seen it from the observation post a dozen times. But from the higher elevation, in the early morning light, with the full formation around her, the scale of it clarified differently. The valley floor was a wide, shallow bowl, tan and gray and green in patches, cut through the center by the supply trail that wound between boulder fields and dry creek beds. She set up her position on the eastern edge of the shelf and glassed the western approach. For 40 minutes, nothing moved. Then it did. She found it by the movement first, a cluster of figures emerging from a gully on the far side of the valley, at a pace and spacing that didn't match any resupply pattern she had observed. 5 individuals, carrying equipment in the specific distributed load of a crew-served weapon system. She tracked them for 4 minutes. They stopped at the position she had identified as the highest probability placement site. She watched one of them begin setting up the base plate. Her hands were very steady. She keyed the radio. Turner, Overwatch element. I have visual on the mortar position. Western approach, bearing 273, approximately 1,850 meters. They are assembling now. A pause. Then Turner's voice, flat and controlled. Say again, Overwatch. I have eyes on a mortar crew actively assembling at the placement site I flagged in the assessments. They are approximately 3 to 4 minutes from operational. The radio crackled. Then she heard Turner, away from the mic, speaking rapidly. Then nothing for 30 seconds, which was not nothing. 30 seconds was the sound of 11 other people absorbing what she'd said. Then, copy, I'm relaying to command, hold position. She kept her scope on the crew and felt the familiar contraction happening, the world getting smaller, clearer, quieter. The mathematics of what she was looking at were unambiguous. The position, the orientation of the weapon, the angle. It was pointed at the valley floor directly below the ridgeline, where 12 American soldiers were currently sitting with no significant cover. One of the figures lifted the mortar tube. Another was setting the bipod. A third carried ammunition. The patrol was exposed. If the weapon fired before authorization to engage came through the chain, the blast radius at this elevation and angle would be... She ran the number automatically. She didn't want to run it, but her brain did it anyway. She keyed the radio again. Turner, they are 90 seconds from first round ready. I need authorization or I need the patrol to move, one or the other, right now. Another pause. Longer. She heard Turner arguing with someone on a different frequency. Heard fragments. Unauthorized observation. She's been consistent for 9. And then a different voice, older, clipped. Standing orders require command authorization before... One of the figures lifted a round toward the weapon. Natalie's breathing was very slow. The crosshairs were perfectly still. The wind was reading exactly as predicted. She had 1 round chambered and 6 in the magazine, and she knew the exact firing solution, and she knew where this was going, and she waited. She waited, because the rules existed for reasons, and she respected the reasons, and she was not a person who made unilateral decisions in a vacuum. She was a soldier in a chain of command. She waited until the radio came alive with Turner's voice and the voice behind Turner's, and the sound of a command element that had just been handed a very specific and very urgent problem. And then the radio said something, and everything on the ridge stopped moving, except Natalie. Natalie brought the rifle to her cheek and settled behind the scope and found the target. The world went silent. The crosshairs didn't waver. The enemy commander stepped forward and raised his hand. The signal, she recognized it, the preparation command. And in the 3-second window between that motion and the first round dropping into the tube, Staff Sergeant Natalie Brooks of Harlan County, Kentucky, who had the highest marksmanship score in the battalion and who had been told 9 days ago to hand over her rifle, held her breath, held it, and waited for the space between heartbeats. The space arrived. The trigger broke cleanly. The rifle thundered against her shoulder. The bullet left the barrel at 783 meters per second and began its arc across 1,850 meters of mountain air. And in that moment, in the long suspended silence of those nearly 3 seconds, the radio crackled to life with a voice she didn't recognize. Command to Overwatch. Be advised. Full authorization denied. Repeat, authorization has not been granted. Stand down. Stand down. The bullet was already gone. The bullet was already gone. That was the only thought she had in the first half second after the shot. Not whether she'd hit the target, not what authorization denied meant for her career, not what Turner was going to say. Just that simple, irreversible fact. The bullet had left the barrel at 783 meters per second, and it was traveling through 1,850 meters of cold mountain air, and neither the radio nor Lieutenant Voss nor the entire chain of command above him could call it back. Physics didn't negotiate. She kept her eye behind the scope. 1 second. The enemy crew was still moving. The commander's hand still raised, the round still in the loader's grip, the whole sequence suspended in the moment before completion. 2 seconds. Natalie didn't breathe. She was aware of everything around her with that particular hyper-clarity that came after a shot. The wind against her neck, the rock under her elbows, Ramirez somewhere behind her saying something she couldn't process yet, Turner's voice still cutting through the radio in clipped, urgent fragments. 3 seconds. The enemy commander dropped. Not slowly, not dramatically. He simply stopped being upright and became a different shape on the ground, and the two men closest to him froze for exactly the kind of moment that told Natalie everything she needed to know about their training level and their nerve. And then the moment broke and they ran. Both of them, abandoning the mortar tube, the bipod, the ammunition still in the loader's hands, running back toward the gully they'd emerged from with the specific graceless urgency of people who had just understood something terrible about their situation. The third man followed, then the fourth. The position was empty. Natalie exhaled. She kept her scope on the abandoned equipment for another 30 seconds, cataloging. Mortar tube still attached to the base plate. 3 rounds beside it. The commander's body at the edge of the setup position. Nobody coming back for any of it. Then she lowered the rifle and became aware of the world behind her. The ridge had gone very quiet. Ramirez was the first one to speak. Did you just... He stopped, started again. Brooks, did you just take that shot? She was already doing the post-shot check. Chamber, safety, sitting up from the prone. Her hands were steady. They were always steady after. It was before that cost her. Call it in, she said. Mortar position neutralized. Enemy crew dispersed. 1 KIA at the position. We need eyes on that gully for secondary movement. Authorization was denied, someone said from behind her. Corporal Detweiler, she thought, without turning around. Young voice with a thread of something in it that wasn't quite accusation and wasn't quite admiration. Something caught between both. Call it in, she said again. Turner was already on the radio. She could hear his voice, controlled, professional, giving the situation report in the clipped shorthand of someone who had done this enough times that the words came automatically regardless of what he was feeling inside. Contact report. Grid coordinates. Enemy crew dispersed. 1 enemy KIA. No friendly casualties. She listened to him give the report and watched the gully through her scope and noted that nothing was moving in it. The radio crackled back. The voice that came through was not Voss. It was Captain Halloway, and she sounded like someone who had just been handed a problem she'd been half expecting and fully dreading for some time. Overwatch element, confirm. Shot was fired before authorization was granted. Turner looked at Natalie. She was still watching the gully. Confirm, Turner said into the radio. A pause, long enough that she could hear the ambient noise of wherever Halloway was standing. Wind, a generator somewhere, the faint crackle of another frequency bleeding through. Copy, hold position, I'm coming to you. The next 4 hours were the specific kind of awful that didn't involve anyone shooting at you. They held the ridge position while the patrol secured the abandoned mortar site below. 2-man teams moving down the slope in staggered formation, clearing the position, documenting the equipment. Natalie watched them through her scope because watching kept her useful, and useful kept her from thinking too hard about the radio message that was still sitting in the air around her like weather that hadn't broken yet. Authorization has not been granted. Stand down. She had not stood down. She knew every procedural consequence that could flow from that decision. She had known them when she pulled the trigger. You didn't spend 3 years in the Army without understanding exactly what the paperwork looked like when a soldier discharged a weapon without authorization, regardless of outcome, regardless of what the target had been 3 seconds away from doing. The institution had rules about sequence, about chain of command, about the specific order in which decisions were supposed to move from person to person before they became actions. Those rules existed because armies without them stopped functioning. She understood that. She had always understood that. She had pulled the trigger anyway. Ramirez brought her water from his kit without being asked. He didn't say anything when he handed it to her, which was the right call, and she took it without thanking him, which was also the right call because they both understood that the social transaction was not the point right now. He stood beside her for a moment, looking down at the mortar site below, and she could feel him doing the math. The same math she'd done, the same math everyone on the ridge had now done, working backward from the abandoned tube and the figure on the ground to the moment 30 seconds before it, when the round would have dropped into the barrel and the valley would have changed entirely. He went back to his position without saying anything. Turner came and sat beside her on the rocks about 90 minutes in. He moved with the deliberate care of a man whose knees had opinions about mountain terrain, and he settled onto a flat rock and put his forearms on his thighs and looked out at the valley below them without speaking for a while. "Holloway's 40 minutes out," he said finally. Natalie nodded. "Voss is with her." She nodded again, kept her eyes downrange. "Brooks." Turner waited until she turned to look at him. His face was doing nothing in particular, which was how she knew he was thinking hard. "Walk me through the 3 seconds before you fired." It wasn't exactly a question. "I had the solution," she said. The commander was giving the preparation command. Right arm raised, loading team already in sequence. I had maybe 2 seconds, possibly less, before first round. The authorization call came in at the same moment. "You heard the radio." "I heard the radio." "And you fired." "I fired." Turner was quiet for a moment. A hawk moved in wide, lazy circles over the far ridge, riding a thermal, entirely indifferent to everything happening below it. The mountains beyond the valley were clean and pale in the mid-morning light, the kind of scenery that looked like it belonged on a recruitment poster and had nothing to do with any of this. "What would have happened," Turner said carefully, "if you hadn't?" Natalie looked down at the patrol below. 12 people spread across the ridgeline. Ramirez with his stylus and his questions, Detweiler who'd spoken up in that caught voice. 7 other soldiers she'd been on patrol with long enough to know which ones snored and which ones couldn't function before their first coffee, and which ones wrote letters home every single night without fail, the same way other people said prayers. "I know what would have happened," she said. "I know you do." Turner picked up a small flat rock from beside him and turned it over in his palm, examined it like it had something to say. "What I need you to be able to articulate, to Holloway, to whoever comes after Holloway, is the difference between knowing you were right and demonstrating that you made the correct decision under the specific conditions present. Those are not the same argument, and they require different language." Natalie thought about that. It was the kind of distinction that mattered in rooms with whiteboards and folders, which was where she was going to be spending the next several days. "The authorization process had a structural lag," she said. "The lag exceeded the available window. I had direct observation, a confirmed firing solution, and a precise timeline estimate derived from 9 days of continuous pattern analysis. The window closed before the authorization process could complete. I made a decision based on available information under time constraint. That's the technical frame." "Yes." "Is there a human one?" She looked at him for a moment. 12 people were going to die, she said. "I could stop it. I stopped it." She paused. "I'll take whatever comes from that." Turner set the flat rock down carefully, like he was placing it rather than dropping it. "All right," he said quietly. "Then let's make sure you understand what's coming." What was coming arrived in 2 vehicles and a rooster tail of dust about 30 minutes after that, which meant Holloway had been moving faster than her radio estimate when she'd called. Natalie noted that. It told her something about how seriously this was being taken at the command level, which told her something else about the size of what she'd stepped into. She watched the vehicles from the ridge. The patrol had pulled back to the shelf and was standing in loose formation, not quite attention, not quite at ease, the specific posture of soldiers who know something official's about to happen and aren't sure which direction it's going to fall. Captain Adrian Holloway was 40 years old, maybe 41, and had the lean, slightly worn look of a woman who had never had the luxury of being anything other than exactly as capable as she was. She'd done 2 previous deployments and ran the company with the kind of quiet competence that made you understand, without anyone explaining it, why some people got promoted and others simply stayed very good at their current job. She was not warm, she was fair. In Natalie's experience, fair was rarer and more valuable. Voss was 2 steps behind her. Natalie studied him as they climbed the last section of the trail. He looked like someone who had been in a meeting he hadn't seen coming. There was a particular tightness around his jaw, a quality of controlled recalibration that she recognized as the expression of a man who was still working out the geometry of what had happened and where he stood in relation to it. Holloway came directly to Natalie. She stopped 2 feet away and looked at her without speaking for a moment. A measuring look. Not hostile, but more like a person running a final check on a calculation before committing to it. "Walk me through it," she said. Not, "What were you thinking?" Not, "Do you understand what you just did?" Just, "Walk me through it." The language of a commander who wanted the data before she wanted anything else. Natalie walked her through it. She was precise and she was brief, and she did not editorialize or reach for justification. She described the observation, the movement pattern she'd been tracking for 9 days, the assembly sequence she'd witnessed through the scope that morning, the specific moment of the preparation command, the timeline calculation between that command and the projected first-round moment, and the authorization lag on the radio as she'd experienced it. She laid it out in flat sequential order, because that was what it was. Holloway listened without interrupting once. When Natalie finished, Holloway turned and looked at the valley below them for a long moment, at the abandoned mortar position, at the equipment still sitting there, at the shape near the base plate that nobody had moved yet. Then she turned to Voss. "Lieutenant?" Voss straightened slightly. "Staff Sergeant Brooks filed how many formal assessments about this position?" A beat, short but present. "2 formal assessments, ma'am. Both were evaluated within acceptable risk parameters given current intelligence." "3, Turner said. Quiet. No inflection, just a number. Voss looked at him. 3 formal assessments, Turner said again. The 3rd came in 4 days ago. I forwarded it with an additional notation attached. He reached into his field notebook, the worn green cover, the elastic band around it, and produced the papers. Folded, slightly creased from being carried, but entirely legible and entirely real. I have the copies here. The silence that followed was the specific kind that didn't need to be filled. Holloway took the papers. She looked at the first assessment, then the second, then the third. She looked at the notation from Voss's office on each one. She looked at the timestamps on the forwarding records. She handed the papers back to Turner without commenting on them. Full after-action report on my desk by 1800, she said to the assembled patrol. Not to any one person, which was its own message. Every soldier on this ridge, written statement, what you observed, what you heard on the radio, what happened, and in what sequence. She looked at Natalie. That includes you. Yes, ma'am. You're in a complicated position, Staff Sergeant. I know, ma'am. The shot was tactically sound. The circumstances surrounding it were not clean. Holloway held her gaze. Do you understand the distinction I'm making? Yes, ma'am. Good. She looked at the patrol. Get these people off the ridge, Sergeant Turner. Site documented, personnel back at the FOB before dark. She turned and walked back toward the trail. Voss stayed a moment longer. He looked at the valley. He looked at the papers in Turner's hand. He looked finally at Natalie. And it was a different look than the one he'd given her in the briefing room 9 days ago, when he'd said, "Take that rifle away from her," in the tone of a man issuing a correction. This one was harder to categorize. Not apologetic, not warm, something more private than either of those. The expression of a man in the process of revising a conclusion he'd been confident in and not entirely comfortable with what the revision was revealing. He walked away without saying anything. Natalie watched him go and turned back to her position and began breaking it down. Scope case first, then cleaning kit, then magazines. The small practice sequence of tasks that her hands knew without being told, which was useful right now because it kept her hands busy while the rest of her stayed quiet and processed what had just happened on this ridge in the last 4 hours. Ramirez appeared beside her. "So," he said carefully, in the voice of someone who wanted information but understood he was on uncertain ground. "Is that good, what she said?" "It's complicated." "Like good complicated or bad complicated?" Ramirez. "Yeah? Help me carry this down the hill." He picked up the case without another word. She shouldered the rifle and they started down the trail, and the mountain was steep and cold and indifferent. And below them the valley sat in the late morning light with its abandoned mortar position and its supply trail and its particular silence that was the silence of something that had almost happened and hadn't. The after-action reports took most of the night. Natalie wrote hers at the small desk in her quarters, a cup of cold instant coffee going tepid at her elbow. And she brought the same attention to the document that she brought to a firing solution: precision, sequence, no waste. She was specific about the timeline to the second where she could be. She included the exact wording of the radio transmission she had heard before firing, in quotation marks, because exact wording mattered in formal records. She included the calculation she had run regarding the projected first-round window versus the observed authorization lag. She described every assumption she had made and identified the data that supported each one. She did not use language that framed the decision as heroic. She did not use language that minimized it either. She described it as a tactical decision made under specific time constraints using available information, and she signed the bottom of the last page at 2,347 and filed it through the proper channel and sat for a while in the dark of her quarters, listening to the wind move across the FOB and thinking about nothing in particular, which was what she did when she needed to let her mind settle after something large. She didn't sleep much. 3 days passed with the particular quality of institutional silence that had its own texture if you'd spent enough time in organizations that ran on documentation and chain of command. Natalie had. She knew the difference between the silence of being forgotten and the silence of a file being read very carefully by several people who hadn't expected to be reading it. This was the second kind. She could feel it in small calibrations. The way Holloway's aide made brief eye contact in the corridor and then looked away a half-second faster than normal. The way the briefing room had a different quality of attention in it now, a fraction of extra awareness that hadn't been there before the ridge. The fact that Voss had quietly transferred the patrol roster function back to Turner sometime in the last 48 hours without making an announcement about it. She continued her duties: patrol rotations, weapons maintenance, the daily administrative requirements of being a soldier in a forward operating base. She answered questions when people asked them and offered nothing when they didn't, which was the only sensible approach when a formal process was running. On the second evening, Ramirez found her eating alone in the corner of the mess with a tray of food she was giving about 30% of her attention. He sat down across from her with his own tray and the expression of someone who had been working up to something. "Voss talked to me today," he said. She looked up. "Not about the shot, about my patrol report." Ramirez pushed food around his tray. "He asked me to walk him through my observations chronologically. I did. He didn't say much, just listened." He looked at her across the table. "He seems different." "Different how?" "I don't know exactly. Like something got knocked loose and he's still figuring out where it landed." Natalie considered that. "Did he say anything about the assessments?" "No, but he asked me." Ramirez paused. "He asked me, specifically, whether I had read your third assessment before the patrol. I said I'd heard you discuss the content with Turner, but I hadn't read the document itself." "What did he say to that?" "Nothing. He just wrote something down." Ramirez finally ate something. "He looked tired, Brooks. Like Actually tired. Not just not enough sleep tired. The other kind. The other kind. She understood what he meant. There was exhaustion that came from overwork, and there was exhaustion that came from discovering that a framework you'd been operating inside was built wrong, and the second kind went deeper and took longer to recover from. She didn't have a lot of sympathy to spare right now, but she noted it. On the fourth day, she was called to Holloway's office. The office was small and organized with the unsentimental efficiency of a space that functioned as a workspace rather than a representation of anything. Stacked folders, a whiteboard covered in scheduling grids and abbreviated notations. One photograph on the desk, a landscape, mountain somewhere, nothing to do with the current situation. Holloway was behind the desk when Natalie came in. There was a second person in the room, seated in the chair to Holloway's left, a man she didn't recognize. He was in uniform, senior NCO, with a face that operated in neutral by default and eyes that were doing considerably more than his expression suggested. "Sit down, Brooks," Holloway said. She sat. "This is Sergeant First Class Devlin. He's CID." She said it without setup or softening. "He has some questions." CID. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division. Natalie held her expression exactly where it was and ran through the range of reasons CID would be involved in what had so far been a battalion-level after-action matter. The unauthorized discharge was the obvious starting point, but CID operated on a different scope than administrative review, and their involvement suggested the investigation had expanded in a direction that wasn't entirely about what happened on the ridge. Devlin looked at her with the specific attention of someone whose professional function was to watch people receive information and note what they did with it. "You filed 3 formal assessments about the mortar position," he said. "You also made 2 verbal reports to Sergeant First Class Turner, which he documented in his personal log. You purchased match-grade 7.62 ammunition from your own funds, roughly $300 worth, for range training outside your standard allocation." He said all of this without questioning it yet, just laying the record out where they could both see it. "That's accurate," she said. "You signed into the back range at 0420, 0415, and 0408 on 3 consecutive mornings. Range was officially unoccupied during those periods. Range rules permit individual use during unoccupied periods." "They do." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to ask you something that isn't about the shot itself." She waited. "The pattern of duty reassignments and operational scope limitations you experienced under Lieutenant Voss, is this the first time you've encountered this, or does it follow a pattern across prior postings?" The question was not what she'd expected, and she had been expecting something. She kept her voice level. "Could you be more specific about what you mean by pattern? I mean systematic removal from your designated marksman role during periods when your assessments were not aligned with the commanding officer's operational picture." Devlin glanced briefly at Holloway, then back. "We've reviewed duty logs from your previous posting. There are 3 instances of temporary reassignment from DM duties that appear to follow a similar sequence. Assessment filed, assessment dismissed, duties modified." The room was very quiet. "I wasn't aware anyone had pulled those records," Natalie said carefully. "We did." A pause. "Are the 3 instances I'm describing accurate?" She thought about this previous posting, about a different FOB, a different commanding officer, a different version of the same conversation she'd been having at various volumes for 3 years. About 3 separate moments when she'd submitted an assessment that was inconvenient for someone's operational narrative, and had found her duties quietly contracted in the days that followed. She had never filed a formal complaint about any of them. She had documented them in her own records. She had told Turner about one of them, over coffee, about 8 months ago, in the way you tell someone something you can't do anything about, because at least then it exists somewhere outside your own head. "The 3 instances are accurate," she said. Devlin wrote something down. "Sergeant Devlin," Holloway said, with a quiet precision that indicated she was redirecting rather than correcting, "let's stay within scope for this conversation." Devlin nodded and sat back. Natalie looked at Holloway directly. "What's in scope?" Holloway folded her hands on the desk surface. The photograph of the mountain sat to her left, slightly angled. "The after-action review of the Ridge incident is running its standard course at battalion level. The question of the unauthorized discharge is being handled through that process." A pause. But the review has surfaced adjacent questions that fall under a different authority, Devlin's authority. The dismissed assessments. Among other documentation, yes. Natalie sat with that for a moment, letting it arrange itself. 3 assessments dismissed at this posting. 3 instances of duty contraction at the previous one. CID pulling records across postings. The scope of what was being investigated had evidently grown in a direction that had nothing to do with whether she should face consequences for firing without authorization. "Am I in trouble?" she asked, because there was no version of this conversation that got more useful by not asking the direct question. Holloway looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on her face was the one Natalie associated with people who were being honest rather than reassuring. "That," she said, "depends on which part of what happened we're talking about." The week that followed moved at the speed of institutional process, which was not fast. Natalie continued her duties. She went on rotations, maintained her equipment, attended briefings where Voss managed the operational content with his usual efficiency and a quality of personal quietness that was new. He did not speak to her directly for the first 3 days of that week. On the 4th, he caught her in the corridor outside the operations center. Not a planned thing, just 2 people moving in opposite directions who both stopped. They stood in the narrow corridor for a moment. "I read the assessments again," he said. He said it without preamble, without the formal framing of a superior addressing a subordinate. "All 3. And Turner's notation on the 3rd. She waited. "The probability calculation in the second one." He stopped. Started again with different words, like the first version hadn't been right. "I understand what you were showing me. I understood it when I read it the first time." A pause. "I chose to weigh it the way I weighed it." She looked at him. "I was wrong about the threat level," he said, "and I was wrong about—" He didn't complete the sentence, but the shape of what he hadn't said was present in the space where the words would have been. She thought about what to say. She thought about 3 years of versions of this, of men who discovered at some point along the way that they had been making the same error in different rooms, and what they did with that discovery varied considerably. Some of them apologized. Some of them doubled down. Some of them, like Voss appeared to be doing right now, stood in a corridor and tried to find the language for something they'd never had to say before and found it harder than expected. "The formal process is still running, sir," she said. "I don't think it's appropriate for us to discuss the specifics outside that framework." A beat. "You're right," he said. The words were brief and they were not easy. "You're right." He nodded once, more to himself than to her, and walked past her down the corridor. She stood there for a moment after he'd gone. What moved through her was not satisfaction. It was not vindication. It was something considerably more ambivalent than either of those. The specific feeling of being right in a way that had cost something real and had not finished costing yet, and knowing that both of those things were simply true and would continue to be true regardless of how the week ended. She went back to work. 8 days after the Ridge, Turner came to find her at the back range. She was working at 800 meters. Consistency work, shorter distances. The kind of maintenance shooting that wasn't about breaking limits, but about keeping her fundamentals clean and honest. The sun was high, and the air had the flat, dry quality of midday at elevation. She fired 4 rounds, grouped them, sat up and looked at the target through the spotting scope, slightly left of center. Consistent across all 4 holes, which meant it was technique rather than equipment. Grip pressure on the offhand. She noted it. Turner crouched beside her with his forearms on his knees and looked at the target. "Holloway wants us both at 1600, he said. "Both of us." "Both of us?" She ejected the magazine and set it beside her knee on the mat. "Do you know what it is?" Devlin finished his preliminary report this morning. Turner picked up one of the brass casings from the ground, examined it, set it back down. Submitted it up the chain with a recommendation attached. "I don't know the recommendation. Holloway's aide wouldn't get into it." Natalie looked downrange at the target. 4 holes, tight group, left of center. She'd corrected on the next string. "Turner," she said, "if it goes badly, it won't go as badly as you're imagining." "You don't know that." "No," he said honestly. "But I know what's in those 3 assessments. I know what's on the radio transcript from the Ridge. Time-stamped, logged, not editable. I know what 12 separate soldiers put in their written statements independently of each other. He stood, both knees registering mild complaint. You documented everything, Brooks, from the beginning. 3 months of observation notes, range logs, formal assessments with timestamps. You built a record without knowing you were building one. He looked down at her. That matters more right now than almost anything else. She gathered her brass from the mat, habit so automatic she barely registered doing it, and thought about what it meant that Turner, with 19 years and a comprehensive understanding of how institutional outcomes could go, was framing this as not as badly as you're imagining, rather than you'll be fine. The distance between those two statements was not nothing. She knew exactly how far apart they were. She packed her kit. They walked to Holloway's office together at 1600, arriving exactly on time, which was its own form of statement. Devlin was not there. The office looked different from the first time she'd been in it. The whiteboard had been erased and rewritten, the stack of folders had changed shape. Holloway was standing rather than seated, which was a small detail that Natalie noted and filed. Holloway looked at them both when they came through the door, and something in her expression had settled since the last conversation. The look of someone who had been calculating and had arrived, with some difficulty, at a conclusion they were now prepared to act on. "Close the door," she said. Turner closed it. Devlin's preliminary investigation has identified a pattern of systematic irregularities in duty assignment records going back further than the current deployment, Holloway said. She said it carefully, the way you say something that has been reviewed before it leaves your mouth. The pattern is not limited to Lieutenant Voss, and it is not limited to this posting. Natalie felt something go quiet in the center of her chest. "How far back?" Turner asked. "Further than this command has authority to address." Holloway's voice was even, which means the matter has been referred up the chain in a way that involves oversight above the battalion level. I've been instructed to hold the proceedings on the unauthorized discharge pending the outcome of the broader inquiry. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the FOB, a vehicle engine started and idled and cut off. "What does that mean practically?" Natalie said. "Practically, it means that what began as an after-action review of a single incident on a ridgeline has become something considerably larger in scope." Holloway looked at her steadily, with the directness of a person who had decided that honesty was the only useful thing she could offer right now. "And it means that the record you built, the assessments, the range logs, the duty documentation, the observation notes, is now evidence in a process that is no longer primarily about the shot." Turner let out a slow breath beside her. Not relief, something more like recognition, the sound of a man who had suspected the shape of something for a while and was now seeing it confirmed. Natalie stood in the small organized office and looked at the whiteboard with its new notations and thought about the very first morning she'd walked out to the observation post before sunrise, alone, in the cold, because the math told her something was there even when every person with authority over her had decided it wasn't worth looking at. She thought about the 3 formal assessments and the 253 rounds she'd fired on the back range on her own time with her own money. She thought about a corridor in eastern Kentucky and her father reading deer sign off frost-covered ground, pointing at things she couldn't see yet, and teaching her that the evidence always came before the belief. She thought about Voss's face in the corridor 2 days ago, the particular cost of that conversation, for both of them. "What process?" she said. Her voice was steady. Holloway reached for the folder on her desk. She held it for a moment without opening it, and there was something in the way she held it, carefully, like it contained something that had weight, that told Natalie the contents of that folder were going to change the shape of the next several months of her life. "That," Holloway said, "is what I need to brief you on." She opened the folder, and the first page was a list of names, 8 names from 3 different postings spanning 4 years, and the second name on the list, below a soldier Natalie had never met at a posting she'd never served at, was her own name. Second on the list, below a soldier named Marcus Webb, specialist, posted to FOB Caldwell in 2009, whom she had never met and whose name she did not recognize. Above a staff sergeant named Priya Anand, posted to a forward element in Kandahar province the same year Natalie had been doing her first deployment cycle in the East. 8 names, 3 postings, 4 years of documented irregularities, and her name was sitting in the middle of the list like it had always belonged there, which in some sense it had. She looked at the page for a long moment. "Who compiled this?" she said. "Devlin's team, working from duty records, assignment logs, and personnel files." Holloway turned to the second page. "The pattern across all 8 cases is consistent. Assessment filed outside the preferred operational narrative. Assessment dismissed or deprioritized. Duties modified within 72 hours of the dismissal. In 6 of the 8 cases, the modification resulted in the soldier being effectively removed from the role where the assessment originated." "All 8 cases involve designated marksmen," Turner said. He said it quietly, like he was confirming something he'd already worked out. 6 of the 8. The other 2 are intelligence analysts." Holloway looked at him. "Both categories share a common function. They generate assessments that can be inconvenient for commanders who have already decided on an operational picture." Natalie turned to the third page. Names she didn't know. Postings she'd heard of but never served at. Dates. The bureaucratic bones of other people's versions of the same experience. The assessment that went nowhere. The duties that contracted. The particular institutional silence that meant you were right, and it doesn't matter. "What happened to the others?" she said. Holloway was quiet for a moment. "Webb left the Army 14 months after the incident at Caldwell. Medical separation, but Devlin's team has flagged the timing." A pause. "Anand filed a formal complaint 18 months after her incident. The complaint was reviewed at the battalion level by the same command structure that had dismissed her original assessments. Meaning it went nowhere. Meaning the review process had a conflict of interest built into it." Holloway closed the folder. 3 of the 8 soldiers are still active duty. You are one of the 3. Natalie set the folder back on the desk carefully. "What does Devlin's recommendation say?" she said. Holloway looked at her steadily. "It recommends elevation to the Inspector General's office and a formal review of duty assignment practices across the affected postings. It also recommends suspension of the battalion-level proceedings against you pending the outcome of that review." Turner said nothing. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man absorbing something that was both better and more complicated than he'd been prepared for. "The IG review," Natalie said. "Timeline. Unknown. These things move at their own pace." Holloway said it without apology because it was simply true, and she was not a person who apologized for things that were simply true. "What I can tell you is that your file goes to the IG's office with Devlin's report attached, and the record you built. Every assessment, every range log, every notation goes with it." Natalie sat with that for a moment. "And in the meantime," she said, "in the meantime, you remain on active duty at this posting under current assignment." A pause. "Under current assignment, as originally designated. Devlin's preliminary finding was sufficient to reinstate your DM designation pending the formal review." The room was quiet. Turner looked at her. She looked at the closed folder on Holloway's desk and thought about Marcus Webb, whom she'd never met, who had left the Army 14 months after FOB Caldwell, and about Priya Anand, whose complaint had been reviewed by the people it was about. She thought about the specific quality of institutional silence she had been living inside for the past 8 days, and about the way it felt different now that she understood its actual shape. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. "It was the only appropriate thing." She said it, and she meant it, and she also understood that the conversation had given her a list with her name on it, and a process that moved at its own pace, and a reinstatement that existed on paper while everything else remained unresolved. Both of those things were true. She was getting better at holding 2 true things at once. She told Turner on the walk back that she needed 30 minutes, and she went to the back range because it was the only place on the fob where she could think clearly while her hands were doing something. She fired 12 rounds at 600 meters and didn't look at where they landed. Then she sat up and looked. 9 of 12 in the group. The left of center drift was still there, consistent, correctable. She knew what it was now. The grip pressure. The way her left hand tensed fractionally in the moment before the trigger broke, a habit she'd developed sometime in the last 3 weeks of high-stress shooting and would now have to consciously undo. She knew exactly how to fix it. That, at least, was clear. The reinstatement was processed the following morning. Paperwork, signatures, the administrative machinery of the Army working in the direction Natalie needed it to work for once. Turner handled most of it. She signed where she was told to sign. She was back in the briefing room that afternoon for the first time since the Ridge in her full capacity, not as a standard patrol element, not as incidental overwatch support, but as the battalion's designated marksman. Her name was on the duty roster in that role. Her rifle was beside her chair. Voss ran the briefing. He covered the operational schedule for the next 72 hours. Patrol routes, sector assignments, radio protocols, weather update from the S2 section. He was professional and he was thorough, and he didn't once look at Natalie's rifle. Not pointedly, not conspicuously. He simply did not look at it, which was different from before in a way that everyone in the room registered without commenting on. Afterward, Ramirez caught up with her in the corridor. "Did I just see what I think I saw?" he said. "If you're talking about the duty roster, yes. That's good, right?" He fell into step beside her. "That's definitively good. It's a start." He thought about that. "Why does everything with you have like 17 layers?" "Because most things have 17 layers. You just usually don't see them." He was quiet for a moment. "The name's on the list. Are you allowed to tell me about that?" "Where did you hear about a list?" "Devlin talked to everyone on the patrol, Brooks. People talk." She stopped walking and looked at him. He met her eyes with the particular quality of attention of a young soldier who was genuinely trying to understand something rather than just collecting information. "No," she said. "I'm not going to discuss the contents of an active investigation." "Okay?" He nodded. "But you're okay." The question was simpler than it seemed, and she thought about it honestly for a moment rather than giving him the automatic response. "I'm working," she said. He seemed to accept that. Matt. 10 days after the Ridge, the FOB received a logistics convoy from the main base. 3 vehicles, 12 personnel, a resupply of ammunition and medical stores, and the kind of miscellaneous equipment that accumulated in requisition lists over weeks. Standard procedure, unremarkable, the operational metabolism of a forward post keeping itself functional. Natalie was at the range when it arrived. She heard the vehicles come through the gate and registered the sound the way she registered most background noise at the FOB. Categorized, filed, not relevant to the immediate task. She finished her string, policed her brass, and walked back toward the operations building. The convoy commander was standing near the vehicles talking to Halloway's aide. Young captain, dusty, the specific look of someone who had been driving mountain roads for 4 hours and wanted coffee and a chair in that order. Standard. Natalie walked past them and went inside. Turner found her 40 minutes later in the small office adjacent to the operations center where she'd been reviewing satellite imagery of Sector 7's eastern approach. A different angle than she'd been working before, a different set of terrain features to account for. "Convoy brought something extra," he said. She looked up. 2 personnel, not on the standard manifest. He set a piece of paper on the desk in front of her. "Arrived with orders I haven't seen before." She looked at the paper. It was a movement order, standard format, except the issuing authority was not the battalion headquarters or the brigade. The issuing authority was an office designation she didn't recognize, a string of numbers and a letter code that meant nothing to her immediately. "What is this?" she said. "I spent 20 minutes trying to find out." Turner sat down. "The short version is that it's a joint office, military and federal, the kind that gets stood up when an investigation crosses jurisdictional lines." She looked at the paper again. The IG referral moved faster than Halloway estimated. Either that, or it was already moving before Devlin submitted his report, and the report gave it enough momentum to break the surface. Turner's voice was careful. "The 2 personnel are here to conduct interviews. They want to speak with you tomorrow morning." "What time?" 800. She nodded and looked back at the satellite imagery. The eastern approach had a series of ridge lines that created natural dead ground. Areas invisible from the standard patrol routes. Areas that would be attractive to a unit that had just lost an established position and needed to relocate. She had been mapping the dead ground for the past hour. "Turner," she said. "Yeah, the eastern approach has 3 viable secondary positions for a displaced mortar element. I want to flag them before the next patrol cycle." He looked at the imagery, then at her. "Write it up," he said. "I'll make sure it goes to Halloway directly." "Not through the standard briefing channel?" A pause. "Write it up," he said again. "We'll talk about the channel after." Chas. The interview the following morning was held in a room she hadn't been in before. a space in the back of the administrative building that was usually used for classified communications, small enough that 4 people in it felt crowded. She arrived at 07:55 and the 2 personnel from the convoy were already there, seated on one side of a small table with a recording device and 2 notebooks, and the kind of organized presence that communicated they had done this before and did not find it complicated. The senior of the 2 introduced herself as Special Agent Karen Lyle. She was mid-40s, civilian clothes, under a light jacket despite the mountain cold, hair pulled back with the functional impatience of a woman who had stopped thinking about her hair sometime around her 3rd federal investigation. Her partner was younger, late 20s, military bearing that he hadn't quite shed, the kind of attentive stillness that suggested he'd been told to listen more than speak. Staff Sergeant Brooks, Lyle said, "Thank you for your time." "Yes, ma'am. I want to be clear about what this conversation is and isn't. This is a voluntary preliminary interview in connection with a referral received by the Inspector General's office. You are not under investigation for any criminal matter. You have the right to have a JAG officer present." "I understand my rights," Natalie said. "I don't need a JAG officer." Lyle looked at her for a moment, not testing her, more like noting something. "All right," she said. "Let's start from the beginning, not the ridge. Earlier." So Natalie started from the beginning. She talked for almost 2 hours. She described her previous posting, the assessment she'd filed about a vehicle pattern that had later been confirmed by an incident report she'd never officially been shown but had heard about through Turner, the duty modification that followed within 48 hours of the dismissal, the absence of any formal documentation of the modification's rationale. She described coming to FOB Granite, the M110 assignment, the first briefing with Voss, the sequence of events from the first observation to the 3rd assessment to the ridge. Lyle asked questions that were precise and non-leading and occasionally circled back to something Natalie had said 20 minutes earlier with a follow-up that indicated she had been tracking multiple threads simultaneously. The younger agent wrote things down and said almost nothing. At one point, about 90 minutes in, Lyle set down her pen and looked at Natalie directly. "In your experience," she said, "was the pattern you encountered at your previous posting and at this one communicated in any coordinated way between commands, or did it occur independently?" Natalie thought about that carefully. "I have no evidence of coordination," she said. "What I can tell you is that the pattern was structurally identical across both situations. Same sequence, same timing, same outcome, whether that's coordination or something endemic to the way a certain category of commander responds to a certain category of assessment." She paused. "I don't have enough information to tell you which it is, but you have an opinion. I have an observation. The assessment process that gets bypassed is always the same type. Overwatch originated, outside the standard intelligence cycle, generated by personnel who aren't in the primary command loop." She kept her voice level. "It's easier to dismiss an assessment if you can dismiss the person generating it at the same time." Lyle looked at her for a long moment. "That's a precise way to put it," she said. "I've had time to think about it." She was back at her rifle by 1100. The morning had taken something out of her, not the interview itself, which she'd handled, but the accumulated weight of saying out loud, into a recording device, in a formal context, the things she had been carrying in her own head for 3 years. It had a specific kind of cost, putting language to things you'd survived by not examining too directly, and she felt it in the particular flatness of her attention when she lay behind the scope that afternoon. She fired 12 rounds and none of them were her best work. She policed her brass and sat up and looked at the target through the spotter and felt, for the first time in a while, something that was simply tired. Ramirez appeared at the edge of the range 20 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him. The particular cadence of his boots on the gravel approach, the slight hesitation before he committed to walking toward someone who was clearly wanting to be alone. She didn't tell him to go away. He sat down on the sandbag wall a few feet from her position and didn't say anything for a while. It was the most useful thing he'd done in weeks. She let the silence sit between them and watched the afternoon light change the color of the mountains and thought about nothing specific, which was what she needed. "My grandfather," Ramirez said eventually, "used to say that the hardest part of being right is the part that comes after." She looked at him. He shrugged. "He was talking about an argument with my grandmother about whether to plant the tomatoes in April or May, but I think it applies." She almost smiled. Almost. What happened with the tomatoes, she said. He planted them in May. They died in a late frost. He paused. He never mentioned it again, which she said was worse than if he'd argued about it. Natalie looked back at the mountains. How'd they do it? She said. Stay together after that. I don't know. I think they just kept going, because stopping wasn't a thing they considered. She thought about Marcus Webb, who had separated from the army 14 months after Caldwell. She thought about Priya Anand's complaint, reviewed by the people it was about. She thought about 6 other names on a list and the specific kinds of cost each of them had paid for the same fundamental problem. Stopping hadn't been a thing she'd considered either. She didn't know if that was strength, or stubbornness, or simply the absence of an alternative. Probably some combination of all 3. Go eat something, she said. I'll be in for the evening brief. He went. She sat for a while longer and then she broke down the rifle and cleaned it and went back inside. The tempo of the following week was different from anything she'd experienced at FOB Granite so far. Lyle and her partner conducted interviews with every member of the Ridge Patrol, with Turner, with 2 other senior NCOs who had served under Voss's command since his arrival. They were methodical and quiet, and present in the way that investigators are present. You didn't always see them, but you felt the shape of their attention moving through the FOB like weather. Voss knew it, obviously. Everyone knew it. The interviews were not secret, though their contents were. He continued to run daily briefings with his usual operational competence, and Natalie continued to attend them. And the distance between those 2 facts, the normalcy of the briefings and the investigation happening around them, created a particular quality of unreality that she suspected everyone in the room felt to some degree. On the 3rd day of that week, Holloway called Turner into her office, and Natalie heard about it secondhand from Turner himself that evening. They found 2 more names, Turner said. He said it quietly, the way you say something that's bad news wearing the coat of confirmation. From a posting in Germany, 2007, before either of ours. Making 10, Natalie said. Making 10. He looked at his coffee. One of the Germany cases. The soldier filed a complaint that went up through the standard channel. The complaint review recommended no action. Who reviewed it? That's what they're looking at now. She sat with that. The shape of the thing was getting clearer the more she looked at it, and clearer was not the same as better. Clear just meant you could see the actual dimensions. Turner, she said, how many people knew this was systemic before Devlin's report? He was quiet for a long time. I think, he said carefully, that some people had pieces of it, not the whole shape. Pieces. He set his coffee down. The kind of thing where each piece looks like an isolated incident until someone puts them in the same room. Devlin put them in the same room. You put them in the same room, Turner said. Devlin gave it a formal name. 14 days after the Ridge, 3 things happened on the same afternoon. The first was that Special Agent Lyle submitted her preliminary report to the IG's office via secure channel, a fact Natalie knew because Holloway told her directly and without ceremony, standing in the corridor outside the operations center, as if it was information Natalie deserved to have promptly, rather than through the administrative delay of a formal notification. The second was that a patrol in Sector 4 encountered indirect fire from the eastern approach, the same area Natalie had been mapping, the same dead ground she'd flagged in the assessment she'd written 2 days after the Ridge. No casualties. The patrol displaced successfully and called in the contact. The origin point was one of the 3 positions she had identified. The third was that Lieutenant Voss requested a formal meeting with Holloway. Natalie didn't know about the third thing until the following morning. She was in the operations center reviewing the Sector 4 contact report, the grid coordinates, the origin point, the precise match to her assessment, when Turner came in and sat across from her and told her. What did he want? She said. I don't know the content. Holloway's aide confirmed the meeting happened. An hour. Closed door. Turner looked at the contact report in her hands. The eastern approach position. Second of the 3 I flagged. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Lyle knows too. She asked me this morning for the timestamp on your assessment. Natalie looked at the report. The origin point was grid reference 274-819, which she could have recited in her sleep. The assessment she'd filed had listed it as secondary probability position, high priority for patrol awareness. The assessment was dated 12 days ago. It's in the record, she said. Everything's in the record, Turner agreed. That's the point. 3 days later, Voss didn't run the morning briefing. Holloway ran it instead. She covered the operational schedule with the same efficiency, the same grid references, the same radio protocols. The content was identical to what a Voss briefing would have contained, but the person behind the whiteboard was different, and the quality of attention in the room was different, and nobody asked where Voss was because the shape of his absence answered the question before it could be spoken. After the briefing, Holloway stayed at the front of the room while the patrol elements filed out. She didn't look at anyone in particular. She stood with the marker in her hand and looked at the whiteboard for a moment after the room emptied. Natalie was the last one out. She stopped in the doorway. "Ma'am?" Holloway looked at her. "The Sector 4 contact," Natalie said. "I want to flag the third position. It's in the same dead ground series, north of the 819 grid by approximately 400 meters. If the element that hit Sector 4 is the same displaced unit from the ridge..." "Write it up," Holloway said. "Have it to me by 1200. "Yes, ma'am." She turned to go. "Brooks?" She stopped. "Lyle's report included a specific notation," Holloway said. She said it in the same even tone she used for everything, but there was something underneath it, not warm exactly, but deliberate. The quality of someone choosing to say something they weren't required to say. About the documentation practices across all 10 cases. The consistent element in the cases that surfaced was that the affected soldiers had their records, assessment logs, duty modification notices, personal notes. A pause. In the cases that didn't surface until now, the documentation had gaps. Natalie looked at her. "You didn't have gaps," Holloway said, simply, factually. Then she turned back to the whiteboard and Natalie walked out into the FOB morning, where the air was cold and clear and the mountains were doing what they always did, which was nothing, which was everything, which was simply being exactly what they were without apology or explanation. She walked to the operations center and sat down and opened her notebook to a clean page and began writing the assessment of the third position. The handwriting was the same as it had always been, small, precise, slightly cramped at the margins where she ran out of line. She had been writing in this same notebook since her first morning at the observation post, which felt like a long time ago and was actually only 3 weeks. She filled in the grid reference, the probable positioning rationale, the sightline calculations, the patrol vulnerability window. She wrote it the same way she'd written all the others, not because she knew this one would matter, because she'd never written them for that reason. She wrote it because the math was there, and somebody had to put it on paper. Summed. The morning Voss left FOB Granite, Natalie was at the back range. She heard the vehicle engine from 300 meters away. A single Humvee, the sound of it distinct in the still morning air. She heard it idle at the gate, heard the gate mechanism, heard it drive away on the mountain road heading back toward the main base. She kept shooting. She was at 1,200 meters, which was not her maximum and not her minimum, just a middle distance she'd been working on because the consistency at extreme range was built on the consistency at every other range, and you couldn't skip the foundation. She fired 8 rounds and sat up and looked through the spotter, 7 of 8 in the group. The one outside was a genuine error. She knew it the moment the trigger broke, knew from the way her breathing had shifted 2 seconds before, a half second of inattention that the rifle did not forgive and the target did not hide. She noted it. She would fix it on the next string. The vehicle was gone. The sound of the engine had faded completely into the mountain silence, which was the particular deep silence of high altitude that made you aware of your own heartbeat if you were still enough to listen. She wasn't thinking about Voss. She was thinking about the third position in the dead ground north of Grid 819, which she needed to flag to the incoming patrol element before their 0900 departure. She was thinking about the left-of-center drift that had been plaguing her fundamentals for 3 weeks and the grip pressure correction that was slowly resolving it. She was thinking about the list with 8 names that was now a list with 10, and about Marcus Webb, and about Priya Anand's complaint that had gone nowhere, and about the particular ongoing cost of that. She reloaded the magazine. She settled back behind the scope. The target was 1,200 meters away, a pale square against the dark rock of the hillside, patient and exact. She found it in the crosshairs and held it there and breathed slowly and waited for the space between heartbeats. The same space she'd been finding since she was 22 years old, on a Kentucky hillside, learning that patience was not passivity, that preparation was not arrogance, that believing in your own calculation when nobody else would look at the numbers was not stubbornness. It was simply the work. She fired, checked the spotter, center. She fired 7 more, and they were all center, every one. And she sat up in the cold mountain morning and looked at the pale square of paper at 1,200 meters and felt something settle inside her that had been restless for 3 weeks, or possibly longer than that. Possibly longer than she'd been at FOB Granite. Possibly since the first time a man in a briefing room had looked at her and decided she was a category rather than a person. And she had learned, for the first time, the particular cost of being right in a way that nobody was looking for. It had settled before. It would come loose again. That was the nature of it. But right now, in this specific cold morning, with the mountains doing what they always did and the empty range and the 8 holes in paper at 1,200 meters, it was settled. She policed her brass. She shouldered her rifle. She walked back toward the FOB where there was a patrol to brief and an assessment to deliver and a day's work waiting, the same as it had always been, the same as it would be tomorrow. She walked at her own pace. The gate opened when she reached it. She went through. The gate closed behind her with the sound of metal on metal, and she walked into the FOB, and the day began. The patrol briefing was at 0900. She delivered the 3rd position assessment to Halloway at 0845, 7 pages, time-stamped, with grid overlays and sightline calculations and a probability ranking for each approach vector. Halloway read the first 2 pages standing up, then sat down and read the rest. And when she finished, she looked at Natalie with the expression of a person who had stopped being surprised by something, but hadn't yet gotten comfortable with it. "I'll have this incorporated into the patrol brief," she said. "The window for the 3rd position opens around 1400 local, based on shadow coverage from the northern ridge. If the element from Sector 4 is repositioning, I'll make sure the patrol leader has it." Halloway set the assessment on the desk. "Brooks." Natalie waited. "Lyle's full report goes to the IG office today. Not preliminary, full." She said it the way she said most things, without decoration, just information laid on the table for the person who needed it. That means the process moves into a different phase. What phase? Formal inquiry, which means personnel with subpoena authority start asking questions that people with rank have to answer. A pause. It also means your battalion-level proceedings are formally suspended, not just held, suspended pending outcome. Natalie nodded once. "There's something else," Halloway said. She waited again. "The IG office requested your full service record, not just the duty logs from this posting and the previous one. The complete record, from enlistment." Halloway looked at her steadily. "Is there anything in it I should know about before they pull it?" The question was direct, the way Halloway was direct, and it deserved a direct answer. "No," Natalie said. "Nothing that isn't already documented." "Good." Halloway picked up a pen. "Get some food before the brief." The patrol left at 0915 with the 3rd position assessment incorporated into their operational parameters. Natalie watched them from the operations center doorway. 12 soldiers moving through the FOB gate in the practiced loose formation of people who had done this enough times that the procedure was in their bodies rather than their heads. She was not on the patrol. This was intentional, and she understood why. The IG process had made her temporarily a figure of some institutional sensitivity, not in a way that affected her duty status, but in the way that keeping an active witness in a forward patrol element during a formal inquiry created complications that Halloway had enough sense to avoid. She went to the operations center and pulled up satellite imagery of Sector 7's northern approach, and worked for 3 hours, and it was the best 3 hours of her week because nobody interrupted her, and the work was clear and the numbers either added up or they didn't. At 13:30, Lyle appeared in the doorway. "Got a few minutes?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Natalie saved her work and swiveled her chair. Lyle came in and sat across from her and set a single folder on the table between them. Not the organized stack from the interview room. One folder, thin, placed with deliberate care. "I want to show you something," Lyle said, "before it becomes formal record and you see it in a different context." Natalie looked at the folder. "Open it," Lyle said. She did. The first page was a duty modification order from her previous posting. She recognized the format. She had a copy of this document in her own records, had kept it precisely because it had no stated rationale, and she'd known, even then, that the absence of rationale was itself a kind of evidence. She looked at it for a moment and then turned to the second page. The second page was the same document from a different posting, different names, different grid location, different date, but the format was identical down to the specific language of the modification clause, which was not standard Army administrative language. It was specific particular phrasing that would only appear in a template. She looked up. Same template, she said. Used across 7 of the 10 cases, Lyle said, with minor variations. 3 different commands, 4 different geographic locations. Natalie set the page down carefully. That's coordination. That's what it looks like, yes. You're confirming this with me because you're the one who flagged the pattern first, and because what you identified as a behavioral sequence matches what we're now seeing as a documented administrative sequence. Lyle's voice was precise and unhurried. Your observation was the trigger that gave us the framework to look for the structural evidence. Natalie thought about the first assessment she'd filed at her previous posting, the duty modification that followed. The way she'd kept the modification notice in a folder in her personal kit, not because she'd known what it meant, just because she'd understood that paperwork that couldn't explain itself was paperwork worth keeping. Who wrote the template? She said. That's what the formal inquiry is going to determine. Lyle picked up the folder. What I can tell you is that the chain traces upward, not horizontally between commands. Upward. The room was quiet for a moment. How far up? Natalie said. Lyle looked at her, not evasively, more like someone calculating what was useful to say against what was premature. Far enough, she said, that the people asking questions now have the authority to get answers. She stood. Staff Sergeant, she paused at the door. Your documentation practices were not normal. In the best sense, most people don't keep modification notices. Most people don't timestamp their own range sessions. Most people file an assessment, get it dismissed, and absorb the lesson that filing assessments isn't worth the cost. I didn't file them to build a record, Natalie said. I filed them because the information needed to exist somewhere. Lyle looked at her for a moment. I know, she said. That's what makes it credible. She left. The patrol came back at 17:10 without contact, which was good news and also confirmation. The third position had shown signs of recent use but no current occupation, which meant the displaced element had moved again, which meant Natalie needed to recalculate the probable relocation vectors based on the new data point. She was doing exactly that when Ramirez knocked on the operations center door at 1800. Evening brief in 10, he said. I know. He came in anyway and leaned against the door frame with the particular quality of ease that meant he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. Lyle talked to me again, he said. I know. She asked about the briefing room, the first day, Voss and the rifle. He was looking at the satellite imagery on her screen. I told her what happened, exactly what happened, same as before. Good. She asked me something else, though. He paused. She asked whether I thought you'd done anything differently after the rifle incident, like changed how you operated, adjusted how you approached your duties. Natalie kept her eyes on the screen. What did you tell her? I told her you went out to the observation post the next morning before 0500, that I heard you leave. He paused. I told her I didn't think you'd changed anything. I told her I thought you'd just kept going, like you hadn't expected anything different. She was quiet for a moment. That's accurate, she said. She wrote it down. He pushed off the doorframe. Brief in 10. He left, and she sat for a moment with the satellite imagery and the recalculation she was in the middle of, and she thought about what it meant that a federal investigator found it notable that she had simply kept going. She thought about what it said about the 10 cases on the list, about how many of those soldiers had stopped doing the thing they were good at, had contracted around the dismissal the way you contract around a wound, protecting it by limiting the range of motion. She understood that impulse. She had felt it. She had also understood that the contraction was what they were counting on. She saved her work. She went to the brief. Holloway ran the briefings for the next 11 days. No replacement for Voss was announced in that time, which was its own kind of announcement. The Army moved personnel with bureaucratic efficiency when it wanted to, and when it didn't, the delay had a reason. Turner told her, on the 8th day, that Voss had been assigned to a desk position at the main base pending the outcome of the formal inquiry. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without editorial comment, just information. Natalie noted it and went back to her work. The work, in those 11 days, was considerable. Lyle's team was still present, still conducting interviews, and the formal inquiry process had generated a secondary request from the IG office for all operational assessments filed at FOB Granite in the past 18 months, which meant that Natalie's 3 assessments were now evidence not just because of what they showed about her situation, but because of what they showed about the pattern of what had happened to them after they were filed. She also filed 4 new assessments in that period. Northern approach, eastern dead ground, a vehicle pattern on the secondary supply route, a communications anomaly she'd noticed in the signal intercept logs that nobody had flagged. All 4 went to Halloway. All 4 received responses within 24 hours. The difference was not subtle, and she was aware of it in a way that she kept to herself because acknowledging it out loud felt premature. On the 12th day, she was called to Halloway's office, and Turner was already there, seated, which was different from every previous meeting. Turner being in the room before her meant the meeting had been organized rather than responsive. This wasn't Halloway calling her in to share information. This was Halloway convening something. A third person was in the room, a man she hadn't seen before, in uniform, with rank she clocked immediately and felt in the back of her throat. Colonel. Full bird, which put him 2 levels above Halloway in the immediate command structure, and his uniform had the particular precision of someone who still cared about the details after enough years that most people stopped caring. He was standing near the window. He turned when she came in. Staff Sergeant Brooks, Halloway said. This is Colonel James Hare. He's the brigade commander, and he's been in contact with the IG's office regarding the formal inquiry. Natalie came to attention. At ease, Hare said. His voice was medium, unhurried. He looked at her with the eyes of someone who had been reading her file and was now comparing the file to the person. Sit down. She sat. I'm going to be direct with you, Hare said, remaining standing, because the situation warrants it, and because I understand you respond better to directness than to institutional preamble. That's in your file too, for what it's worth. She waited. The IG formal inquiry has moved faster than these things usually move, he said. The template documentation Lyle's team identified created a clear evidentiary thread that shortened the preliminary phase considerably. He moved to the chair across from her and sat. What I need to discuss with you today is the status of your case specifically, separate from the broader inquiry. The unauthorized discharge, she said. The unauthorized discharge. He looked at her directly. The formal proceedings have been suspended. That's been communicated to you. What has not been communicated is that the suspension is permanent, not conditional. The room was very quiet. Meaning, she said carefully, meaning the proceeding is closed. No further action. He said it without drama, which was the right way to say it. The IG's preliminary findings established, among other things, that the chain of command failure that produced the conditions on the ridge, specifically the systematic dismissal of documented threat assessments, was a contributing factor to the tactical situation you encountered. Proceeding against you under those circumstances would have been, he paused, choosing the word, contradictory. Turner was looking at the window. His face was doing nothing. Natalie kept her breathing even. There's more, Halloway said. She looked at Halloway. Lyle's team found the origin point of the template, Halloway said. I'll let Colonel Hare explain. Hare looked at Natalie steadily. There was a working group, informal, not officially chartered. It included senior officers from 3 different commands, and it generated a set of administrative practices that were used to manage what the group characterized as, and I'm using their language, assessment instability in forward operating environments. Assessment instability, Natalie said. Their phrase. It referred to the phenomenon of assessments generated outside the primary intelligence cycle that created operational friction. The working group's conclusion was that the friction was best managed by limiting the operational scope of the assessors, rather than evaluating the assessments on their merits. She looked at him. They built a system, she said, for discrediting assessors. They built an administrative framework, he said, That functioned as a discrediting mechanism, yes. He said it without blinking. The distinction matters legally, but not morally. How many people were in the working group? 7. 3 of whom are still in active command positions. He said this last part in a tone that indicated it would not remain true for much longer. Natalie sat with the shape of it for a moment. Not the rage she might have expected. Something colder than rage, more structural. The specific feeling of looking at a blueprint and understanding how a building had been designed to fail in a particular way, and for a particular purpose, and for long enough that the failure had become invisible from the inside. The 10 names on the list, she said. There may be more. The inquiry is ongoing. Hare looked at her. The 3 active duty soldiers on the list, yourself and 2 others, have been formally notified that their records are being reviewed for remediation. Remediation meaning what? Meaning any adverse notation, any duty modification, any administrative action that traces to the framework identified in the inquiry is being reviewed for removal or correction. He paused. Your record from your previous posting is already in that review. Natalie looked at the window. The mountains were visible past the glass, pale and clean and indifferent, the same mountains that had been there every day, that would be there after all of this resolved into whatever it was going to resolve into. What happens to the 7? She said. That's above my authority to discuss in specifics, Hare said. What I can tell you is that the IG's formal inquiry includes a criminal referral component, which means the Department of Justice is involved. Turner finally looked away from the window. He looked at Natalie. She looked at Hare. I want to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. The assessment I filed at my previous posting, the vehicle pattern, the one that was dismissed. She kept her voice even. Was there ever a documented outcome for that pattern? Any subsequent incident? Hare was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. What was it? A pause, longer. An IED strike on a patrol route, he said. 41 days after your assessment was dismissed. 3 soldiers wounded, 1 seriously. He looked at her. The incident report did not reference your assessment. She had suspected this. She had suspected it for 2 years, in the way you suspect something that you can't prove and therefore cannot do anything with. Suspicion without evidence was just weight you carried around and couldn't put down anywhere. Now it had a date and a patrol route and 3 names she didn't know and would probably never be told. She sat with it. The room let her. All right, she said finally. It came out quieter than she intended. The inquiry will document it, Hare said. That's not nothing. No, she said. It's not nothing. She went to the range after the meeting because she didn't know what else to do with herself, and the range was where she went when the rest of the world needed somewhere to be while she was elsewhere. She didn't shoot. She sat on the sandbag wall and looked at the targets and thought about 3 soldiers on a patrol route 41 days after her assessment was filed, and the specific and permanent nature of 41 days when it contained the thing it had contained, and the administrative framework that had made that 41 days possible by design. Assessment instability. She said it out loud once, to the empty range in the mountains. Then she picked up her rifle and fired 20 rounds at 1,000 meters, and every single one of them was where she meant for it to be, which was not catharsis and was not resolution, and was simply the thing she was good at, done the way she'd always done it, which was the only response she'd ever had that was fully her own. Turner came eventually. He always came eventually. He sat beside her on the sandbag wall, and they looked at the targets together without speaking for a while. And the wind came off the upper ridge and pushed dust across the range, and the mountains were doing what mountains did. The 2 others on the list, she said, the other active duty ones. I know one of them, Turner said. Indirectly. Heard the name through channels, he paused. She's stationed in Germany. Is she all right? He thought about that for a moment. She's still in, he said. That's something. Natalie nodded. She thought about Marcus Webb, who wasn't still in. She thought about Priya Anand and the complaint that had gone in circles. She thought about the 7 names at the bottom of the list and the 41 days and the 3 soldiers on the patrol route. I should have pushed harder at the previous posting, she said. Turner looked at her. I knew the modification was retaliatory. I kept the paperwork. I didn't file a formal complaint because I'd already seen what happened to people who filed formal complaints into the same chain that was retaliating against them. She paused. I was right that it wouldn't go anywhere. But if I'd pushed, you don't know what happens in the alternate version, Turner said. You can't run that calculation. There's no data. There's data. 3 soldiers on a patrol route. That's not on you, he said. That is specifically, precisely, exactly not on you. You filed the assessment. You did your job. The system failed. His voice was level, not unkind, and not gentle in the way that avoided the truth. The system failed because people in it made decisions to make it fail. That's where the weight goes. She knew he was right. She also knew that knowing he was right did not fully resolve the weight, and that it probably wouldn't for a long time, and that this was simply a thing she would carry. She picked up her rifle. I need to file the Northern Approach update, she said. I know. Holloway needs it before the 1800 brief. I know that too. Turner stood. His knees made their opinion known. I'll walk back with you. They walked back through the range gate and across the FOB in the late afternoon light, and the mountains cast long shadows across the compound. And she thought about the meeting with Hare and about the document with the 7 names, and about an informal working group that had sat in a room somewhere and decided that the most efficient solution to an inconvenient problem was to make the people generating it smaller. She thought about the list with 10 names. She thought about how many lists there were that nobody had made yet. Okay. The formal notification arrived 2 weeks later. Not to her. To Holloway's office, which then notified her, which was the way the Army delivered things that weren't quite good news and weren't quite bad news, but were instead the particular category of institutional communication that represented a process completing a phase. The notification was 2 pages. The first page confirmed the permanent suspension of the unauthorized discharge proceedings and the formal correction of her duty record from the previous posting. 3 specific notations removed, the duty modification order flagged for administrative error, the record restored to its pre-modification state. The second page was a citation attached to the formal inquiry findings, acknowledging her role in surfacing the pattern of administrative misconduct. The citation was not a medal. It was a notation in the formal inquiry record, which meant it would exist as long as the record existed, which was likely to be a very long time. She read it twice and put it in the folder where she kept important paperwork, behind the duty modification order she'd kept for 2 years, and the range logs, and the 3 assessments. It sat there with the rest of the record she hadn't known she was building. Ramirez found out somehow. She suspected Turner, who denied it with the specific energy of a man who was lying and knew he'd been caught, and came to find her that evening in the common room where she was eating dinner with the focused inattention of someone whose mind was somewhere else. He sat across from her. I heard, he said. It's a notation, she said. It's not a parade. Still. She ate. He watched her eat. Are you going to do anything to celebrate? He said. I filed an assessment on the Northern Approach this afternoon. That's not celebrating, Brooks. It's what needed doing. He sighed in the specific way of someone who had accepted that this was simply who they were dealing with. Can I at least say congratulations without you correcting me? She looked at him across the table. He was 22 years old and from Albuquerque, and had been on the ridge with her 3 weeks ago, and had told Lyle the truth in his interview without being coached, and had brought her water without being asked. He had, in his limited and imperfect and genuinely well-intentioned way, been doing something resembling the right thing throughout all of this. Congratulations doesn't fit, she said, but I appreciate it. He seemed to accept that too. Surprise. 3 days after the notification, Hare called her back to Holloway's office. This time she went alone. Turner wasn't there. Holloway was at her desk but stepped out when Natalie arrived, which was deliberate. The specific choreography of a meeting that was meant to be between 2 people. Hare was standing at the window again. The same window, the same mountains. I have a proposition for you, he said. He said it without turning around, which she noted. The window framing was not accident. It gave him something to look at other than her reaction to what he was about to say, which told her the proposition was something he expected to produce a reaction. She stood and waited. He turned. The IG inquiry has created a secondary requirement, he said. The Army needs to review its assessment integration protocols. Specifically, how Overwatch and intelligence assessments from non-primary cycle personnel are evaluated and incorporated into operational planning. He looked at her directly. You have 3 years of documented experience with both the failure mode and the correct process. You've been filing assessments in hostile environments for long enough that your methodology is essentially what the protocol should look like. She kept her expression neutral. You're describing a consulting function. I'm describing a formal role. Working group, 6 months, based at the main base with periodic field consultation. The working group's output would become the basis for a revised assessment integration standard. He paused. You would be the senior NCO advisor. She looked at him. I'm a staff sergeant in a forward operating environment, she said, with active operational assessments pending. You're a staff sergeant with documented methodology that the Army spent 4 years and 10 careers inadvertently stress testing, he said, and we know it works. You need someone with more rank for a working group advisory role. We need someone with the right methodology and the documented record. The rank is a lever I can pull. He said it simply, if you want it pulled. She stood in the office and looked at the mountains through the window and thought about what she wanted, which was a question she hadn't asked herself in a while, because wanting things required imagining a future where what you wanted was possible. And she'd been living close enough to the present that the future had gotten theoretical. The Northern Approach assessments, she said. Someone would need to continue them. That's a resource problem, not an argument against the proposition. There are active indications of a repositioned mortar element in the eastern dead ground. 3 probable positions, 2 of which have shown recent use. The third hasn't been physically cleared. Brooks, his voice was patient. I'm not asking you to abandon the operational picture. I'm asking whether you're willing to contribute to fixing the system that spent 4 years making sure your operational picture was the only one you were allowed to have. She looked at him. The question was clear and it was fair, and it had an answer. I need to brief Holloway on the 3rd position before I give you an answer, she said. The patrol window opens at 1400 and someone needs to have that assessment. Hare looked at her for a moment. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, more like recognition of a specific category of person. Brief Holloway, he said. Then come back. She went and briefed Holloway, 7 minutes, precise and complete, and Holloway incorporated it into the afternoon patrol parameters without comment. Then she went back to Hare's temporary office and stood in the doorway. Yes, she said. Hare nodded once, picked up a pen. I'll start the paperwork. There's a condition. He looked up. The 2 other active duty soldiers on the list. I want to know who reviews their records, and I want to know the outcome. She kept her voice level. Not because I have authority over the process, because they're on the list and I know what that costs, and they should know someone is paying attention. Hare set the pen down. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was harder to read than his previous ones. I can commit to keeping you informed through appropriate channels, he said. That's sufficient. He picked the pen back up. She stood in the doorway while he wrote, and outside the mountains were what they always were. And on the range somewhere behind the administrative building, her M110 was in its case waiting for the next string of work. And in the patrol that was currently on its way out, the gate was the 3rd position assessment she'd written this afternoon. 3 days of observation data condensed into 7 pages of precise documented calculation. She thought about Hare's phrase, stress testing, 4 years and 10 careers. She thought about what it meant that the Army's solution to discovering what had been done was to ask the people it had been done to help build something better. It wasn't the same as justice. It was adjacent to justice. It was the kind of thing that came in the space between what had happened and what would happen next, and it was imperfect in the specific ways that institutional things were imperfect. And it was also, she turned the word over, checking it, real. Something real that would exist in the form of a protocol that other people would be required to follow. In environments where the math mattered, and the person doing the math had historically been the most convenient thing to remove when the math was inconvenient. She didn't know if it would be enough. She knew it was more than she'd had when she walked into the briefing room 3 weeks ago and Voss told someone to take her rifle. How long before the paperwork clears, she said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I have assessments to finish in the interim. I'd expect nothing less, Hare said, without looking up from the page. She left. She walked across the FOB in the late afternoon with the shadows coming long off the mountains, and she thought about going to the range, and then she thought about the satellite imagery she hadn't finished reviewing for the Eastern Sector's secondary approach, and she went to the operations center instead. She sat down at the workstation. She pulled up the imagery. The mountains were pale and still in the satellite view. The same mountains from above, dimensionless, the terrain reduced to color and shadow. She could identify the dead ground from here, the three positions, the approach vectors. She could see the shape of the problem the same way she'd seen it from the observation post at 0500 on cold mornings, the same way she'd seen it through her scope on the ridge. The math was the same from any angle. She opened a new document and began the assessment. The cursor blinked in the empty field where the date went, and she typed the date, and then the grid reference, and then the first line of the observation summary, the same way she had typed the first line of every assessment for 3 years. Not because anyone was watching, not because she knew it would matter, but because the information needed to exist somewhere and she was the one who could put it there. She typed. Outside, the patrol was heading toward the third position with her calculations in their kit. Above the FOB, the mountains went quiet in the failing light, and somewhere in a filing system that had been built to make her smaller, a notation sat in a formal inquiry record with her name on it. Her name, not a title, not a designation, not a role. And it was not everything, and it was not nothing, and it would be there tomorrow when the next assessment needed to be written. She kept working until the light was gone. The light was gone, and the screen was the only thing illuminating the operations center when the patrol came back through the gate. She heard the vehicles first, the familiar engine note, the gate mechanism, the specific quality of sound that meant everyone had come back in the same condition they'd left in. She'd learned to parse that sound without thinking about it, the same way she'd learned to parse a lot of things. When it carried a different weight, you knew before anyone told you. Tonight it carried the right weight. She saved the assessment and closed the laptop and went to the window. The patrol was dismounting in the compound, gear coming off in the practice sequence, the body language of people who had done the thing they went out to do and were now focused on the immediate requirements of food and water and getting weight off their feet. She scanned them out of habit, counting, checking, the automatic census of someone who had spent 3 years understanding that the number going out and the number coming back was the only arithmetic that really mattered. 12. She went back to her desk and finished the Eastern Sector summary and filed it at 2140, and then sat in the dark operations center for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of rest. She was still there when Turner knocked on the open door at 2200. "Patrol cleared the third position," he said. "Signs of recent use, same as the other two. No current occupation." "They're mobile now," she said, rotating through the dead ground, not holding. "Harder to target." "I know." He came in and sat across from her in the dark. The only light was the standby glow of the equipment. "You talked to Hare." "He told you." "Holloway told me." He was quiet for a moment. "You said yes." "I said yes." Turner nodded slowly. Not a reaction to the decision, more like a man fitting a new piece into a picture he'd been building for a while. She could see it in the way he held the quiet, the particular quality of someone who wasn't surprised by something, even though part of them had expected to be. "Good," he said. "That's good." "It's a working group," she said. 6 months. It might amount to nothing." "It might. A lot of working groups produce documents that sit in a database somewhere." "Also true. I'm not particularly optimistic about institutional process." "I know that." Turner shifted in the chair. "But you said yes anyway." She looked at him across the dark room. "The 2 others on the list," she said. "Someone needs to be paying attention." He nodded. "And the protocol matters," she said, "if it gets written right. If the methodology is built into the standard, not just recommended." She paused. "It matters in the way that makes the next Voss irrelevant, because the framework doesn't let him dismiss the assessment even if he dismisses the person generating it." "Is that why you said yes?" She thought about it honestly. "That and Marcus Webb," she said. Turner didn't say anything. He understood Marcus Webb without needing it explained. They sat in the dark for a while longer, and outside the FOB, the mountains were invisible against the night sky, and the wind came off the peaks the way it always did at this hour, constant and cold and indifferent, and it was almost exactly like every other night she'd spent at FOB Granite, except that it wasn't. and they both knew it wasn't, and neither of them needed to say so. "Get some sleep," Turner said eventually. "I need to finish the Eastern Sector revision first." "Brooks, 30 minutes." He stood. "I'll be up when you're done if you want coffee." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He walked to the door. 30 minutes. He left her to it. The paperwork to transfer her assignment took 19 days, not 3 weeks. The Army moved faster when it was motivated, and the IG inquiry had apparently applied a particular quality of institutional motivation to the relevant departments. In those 19 days, she filed 6 assessments. All 6 went to Halloway. All 6 received responses within 18 hours. 3 of them generated direct operational adjustments. The Eastern dead ground rotation pattern she'd identified, a supply route shift in the northern sector, a communications timing anomaly that the S2 section confirmed when they pulled the intercept logs. She did not think about this consciously in terms of what it meant. She just filed the assessments and received the responses and did the next day's work. On the 14th day, Lyle came to say goodbye. She found Natalie at the range, where else, at 800 on a Tuesday, working at 900 meters. Natalie didn't hear her come up because Lyle moved quietly and the rifle was loud, and she only became aware of her when she sat up after a string and found her standing at the edge of the range in civilian clothes with a cup of coffee and the expression of a woman who had somewhere to be but wasn't in a hurry to get there yet. "Flying out at 1100, Lyle said. Natalie set the rifle across her knees. "Reports done?" "This phase is done. The formal inquiry team takes it from here." She looked at the target downrange. "What's the distance?" 900. "How many in the group?" 8 of 8. Lyle was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Natalie directly. "I want to tell you something," she said. "That won't be in any document." Natalie waited. "The working group that built the template, when we interviewed the members, one of them said something that I've been thinking about since." Lyle held her coffee in both hands. He said the reason the framework worked for as long as it did was that the affected soldiers almost never pushed back formally. They adjusted. They absorbed the modification and kept going and didn't create the kind of institutional friction that triggers oversight. She paused. He said it like it was a design feature, not a flaw. Natalie looked at the target. "He was right that it worked," she said. "For a while. Until you kept the paperwork." Lyle's voice was flat. "Until you documented the modifications without knowing why. Until you filed the 3rd assessment, even after the first 2 went nowhere." She paused. "Most people in your position had stopped filing by the 2nd one. Filing was my job." "Yes." Lyle looked at her. "That's what I've been thinking about. That you kept doing your job not as resistance, not as strategy, just because it was your job." She was quiet for a moment. "That's harder to design around than outright refusal." Natalie thought about that. "It's also how you lose 3 soldiers 41 days after a dismissed assessment," she said. "Yes." Lyle didn't look away. "It is. Both things are true." A pause. "Will they face criminal charges?" Natalie said. "The 7. The referral is with justice. What happens there is not in my hands or yours." Lyle finished her coffee. "But the referral was specific, and it was documented, and it included the incident in your previous posting." She set the empty cup on the sandbag wall. "That's in the record now, permanently." Natalie nodded. Lyle looked at her for a moment longer, the kind of look that was doing something, measuring or acknowledging, or both. "Take care of yourself, Staff Sergeant." "Safe travel," Natalie said. Lyle walked away. Natalie watched her go and then turned back to the target at 900 meters and reloaded the magazine and settled behind the scope and found the center of the thing and held it there. She fired 8 more rounds. 8 of 8. Check. On the 19th day, she packed her kit. It didn't take long. 3 years of deployment had taught her that the things worth keeping were fewer than you thought, and the things you thought you needed were usually just weight. She packed her personal ammunition, her notebooks, the folder with the paperwork, the cleaning kit she'd had since sniper school, a photograph of the Kentucky mountains that she kept not for sentiment exactly, but because it reminded her of the specific quality of light on terrain she knew by heart, and the M11O, which traveled in its case with the care of something that had earned its treatment. She did not pack the duty modification order from her previous posting. She had kept it for 2 years. She looked at it one more time. The specific administrative language, the absence of rationale, the date, and then she folded it and put it in the folder with the formal inquiry notation and the citation and the assessments. She put the folder in the bag. It all came with her. That was the point. Turner drove her to the main base. It was a 4-hour road through mountain terrain, and they spent the first hour mostly quiet, which was fine. Turner drove the way he did everything, with the deliberate economy of someone who had no patience for waste, including the waste of words. The mountains were enormous in the morning light, pale gold and gray, the kind of scenery that stopped meaning anything individually and became more like weather, an ambient condition of existence at this altitude. Around the second hour, somewhere on a switchback section where the drop on the right side was steep enough to be interesting, he said, "You know what the working group will actually be like." "Slow," she said, "a lot of meetings where people talk about the same problem in different language. You'll be the only one in the room who's been in a forward environment in the past 5 years. Probably. You're going to have to say things twice, maybe more." "I know. And the first draft of the protocol is going to be wrong." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "But you're going to fix it." She looked out at the mountains. "I'm going to try," she said. "There's a difference." He nodded. That was the right answer, and he knew it. Somewhere in the third hour, he said, "The soldier in Germany. The one on the list." She turned to look at him. "Her name is Staff Sergeant Yara Osei," he said. "She's a DM element with the 173rd. Hare gave me her contact through appropriate channels, which I'm passing to you through the same appropriate channels." He reached into his shirt pocket with his right hand, keeping his left on the wheel, and produced a folded piece of paper. She took it. She looked at it. A name and a contact address. "Does she know about the inquiry?" Natalie said. "She's been notified. Same notification you got." He looked at the road. "I don't know if she knows there are other people on the list." Natalie folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket. "I'll write to her," she said. "I figured you would." The fourth hour passed through lower terrain, the mountains receding into the background, the road widening as it approached the main base infrastructure. Natalie watched the landscape change and thought about what she was going to say to Yara Osei, who was stationed in Germany and had her own version of the last 3 years, and had been notified by the same bureaucratic form letter, and probably had her own folder of paperwork kept for reasons she couldn't fully articulate at the time. She thought about what she would have wanted someone to say to her at any point in the last 3 years that would have been true and useful, rather than just comforting. She didn't have a perfect answer. She had an honest one, which was different and better. The main base was Fort Harlow, and it was enormous in the way that main bases were enormous. The logistical infrastructure of a sustained military operation laid out across flat ground, the kind of scale that made FOB granite feel like something handmade. Natalie had passed through it twice before, but never stayed. She was assigned quarters in the transitional housing section, a room with a window that faced east, and a desk that was bolted to the wall, and a bed that was the same bed she'd slept in at every posting, more or less, which was not a comfort exactly, but was a kind of continuity. Turner carried her bag to the room and set it down and stood in the doorway. "I go back tomorrow morning," he said. "I know. The Eastern Dead Ground rotation. I'll keep Holloway updated on the pattern. You left good enough notes that whoever picks up the assessment work can follow the methodology." "They'll need to recalibrate for wind shift after week 3, she said. "The upper ridge starts directing differently in late November. I noted it in the file, but it's easy to miss. I'll make sure they know." He stood there for a moment. Turner was not a man who struggled with goodbyes. He'd had too many of them, in too many variations for them to carry the particular weight they carried for people who'd had fewer. But there was something in the way he stood in the doorway that was not quite casual and was taking him a moment to resolve. "You did the right thing," he said. "At every point where it mattered. I want you to know I think that." She looked at him. "Even the shot," he said. "Even the shot," she agreed. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had said the thing he came to say. "I'll be in contact," he said. "I know you will." He left. She listened to his footsteps go down the corridor and then sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the east-facing window and the flat terrain beyond it, so different from the mountains she'd been living in that it felt like a different country. She opened her bag and took out the folder and put it on the desk. She took out the photograph of the Kentucky mountains and put it beside the folder. She took out the M1 1.0 case and set it in the corner of the room where she could see it. Then she lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling and let herself be still for a while, which was harder than it sounds for a person who had spent 3 years in motion. The working group convened for the first time on a Monday morning in a conference room at the Fort Harlow Administrative Complex. 8 people around a table, 2 JAG officers, 3 analysts from the S2 community, a personnel specialist whose function Natalie didn't fully understand until the 3rd meeting, a colonel named Prescott, who chaired the group with the patient efficiency of a man who ran many working groups and had learned to tell within the first hour which ones would produce something real, and Natalie. The first meeting was, as predicted, slow. Introductions, scope definitions, a briefing from one of the JAG officers on the IG inquiry findings that Natalie had already read and didn't need summarized but listened to anyway because the way people summarized things told you something about how they understood them. At the 2-hour mark, Prescott turned to her. "Staff Sergeant Brooks, you've been quiet." "I've been listening," she said. "What have you heard?" She thought about how to say it usefully. "I've heard a description of what the framework did," she said. "I haven't heard yet how you're planning to address the mechanism. The administrative template created a structure where the modification happened before the assessment could be formally challenged. The gap between filing and review was where the damage occurred." She looked at Prescott. "A protocol that only addresses the filing process doesn't close the gap." A pause around the table. "Walk us through what you mean by the gap," one of the JAG officers said. She walked them through it. She talked for 18 minutes and used no jargon she hadn't personally experienced the meaning of. And when she finished, the room was doing the particular quiet of people reorienting toward a problem they'd thought they understood. Prescott looked at her for a long moment. "That's where we start," he said. "Chet." The working group met 3 times a week for the following 8 weeks. It was not fast and it was not smooth, and there were 3 separate instances where the scope of the protocol draft had to be significantly revised because a downstream implication hadn't been caught until someone, usually Natalie or the personnel specialist, a quietly relentless woman named Captain Dora Singh, ran the edge case. Natalie wrote 11 internal memos during those 8 weeks. 7 of them changed the shape of a section. The other 4 were incorporated without change into the final draft, which she knew because she'd been tracking versions. She also wrote to Yara Osei. The first letter took her 4 drafts. She kept starting it with explanations and then deleting them, because Osei didn't need the situation explained. She had her own version of it, and what she needed wasn't explanation. She wrote the final version in 20 minutes, in the direct language of one soldier writing to another, and she said 3 things: that she knew about the list, that she was working on something that she hoped would matter to both of them, and that if Osei wanted to talk, she would pick up the phone. Osei called 6 days later. It was a 40-minute conversation, and Natalie spent maybe 12 minutes of it talking. The rest she listened to a woman describe a posting in Kandahar, and a duty modification, and an assessment about a vehicle pattern that had been dismissed, and a patrol route that had changed 22 days later in a way that Osei had not been officially told about, but had heard about through channels. The way you always heard about things through channels. The way the Army's unofficial information network was more efficient than its official one. Natalie held the phone and listened. When Osei finished, there was a silence. "Does it help?" Osei said, knowing about the inquiry. "Some," Natalie said honestly. "It doesn't fix the 22 days. "No." A pause. "Nothing fixes the 22 days. "I know." Another silence, the kind that wasn't empty, but was full of things that didn't need to be said aloud. "The protocol you're working on," Osei said, "what does it actually change?" "If it's implemented correctly, and that's not guaranteed, it closes the modification window. Assessments from non-primary cycle personnel go into a mandatory review queue with a 48-hour response requirement. The response has to address the substance of the assessment, not just the operational priority. And the modification of duties within 30 days of a filed assessment triggers automatic IG notification." Osei was quiet. "That's the gap," she said. "Yes, that's exactly the gap." "I know." Natalie paused. You're the reason that part is in there. Another silence. Longer. I haven't been told, Osei started. Your case. The timeline. It's in the inquiry record. I read it. Natalie said it simply, without softening it, because Osei was not a person who needed softening. 22 days, not 41. Different patrol route, same mechanism. She heard Osei breathe. Okay, Osei said, quietly. It was a lot of things compressed into 2 syllables. Okay, Natalie said. They talked for a few more minutes about the working group timeline, about Osei's current posting, about a technical question regarding the proposed protocol language that Natalie wrote down and brought to the next meeting. When they hung up, Natalie sat in her quarters for a while with the phone on the desk and looked at the folder with the paperwork in it and thought about the particular shape of a system that had been designed to function by making the people it damaged smaller, and what it took to be the thing the design didn't account for. The protocol went through its final revision on a Thursday, 6 weeks before the end of Natalie's assignment. She read the final draft 3 times. It was 87 pages, which was long, and most of it was necessary, which was the better version of long. The core mechanism, the modification window closure, the mandatory review queue, the IG notification trigger, was intact and correctly specified. The edge cases Singh had caught were accounted for. The language was specific enough to be binding and general enough to survive implementation across different command structures. It was not perfect. She had known going in that it would not be perfect. Institutional documents were not perfect. They were improved drafts of previous imperfect documents, and their value was not perfection but direction. The difference between a current that pushed in the wrong direction and one that pushed in the right one. She signed off on the final review with her name and rank and the date. Then she sat in the conference room after the others had gone and looked at the signature for a moment. Her name on a document that would become Army policy, that would sit in the protocol database alongside thousands of other policies, that would be referenced in briefings she would never attend by commanders she would never meet in situations she could not predict. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about this kind of work. It existed as language in a document, not as an event in a moment. You couldn't photograph it. You couldn't point to the specific second it mattered. It would matter, or it wouldn't, in future situations that hadn't happened yet, in the decisions of people who would never know her name. She picked up her pen and packed it away. The formal results of the criminal referral came down in the 10th week of her working group assignment, which was 2 weeks before her scheduled return to operational duty. 7 individuals. The working group, the informal, uncharterly, deliberately structured mechanism for erasing inconvenient assessors. 3 had accepted plea arrangements with the Department of Justice, which meant they had acknowledged, in formal legal language, what they had built and what it had done. 2 were facing trial. 2 had retired in the preceding years, and the jurisdictional questions around them were still being resolved. 3 of them would face permanent separation from the Army. 2 had already been stripped of command positions. The formal press statement used language that was careful and institutional and covered the material facts without the texture of what it had actually been, which was the nature of formal press statements, and which Natalie had expected. She read the statement once and put it down. She thought about Marcus Webb, who had left the Army 14 months after Caldwell, and whose current whereabouts and situation she didn't know. She thought about Priya Anand, whose complaint had been reviewed by the people it was about, and whether anyone had reached her during the inquiry process, whether anyone had called. She thought about the 7 names on a list that had become 10, and the patrol route 41 days out, and the patrol route 22 days out, and the other timelines she didn't know about, the cases that hadn't surfaced yet. She picked up the phone. She called Osei. "Did you see it?" she said when Osei picked up. "I saw it." Osei's voice was even in the specific way of someone who has been keeping themselves even for a long time. 3 pleas. Yes. Is it enough? Natalie thought about the question honestly. No, she said. It's not enough. It's what exists. A pause. It's more than what existed before the inquiry. A long silence. Webb, Osei said. Do you know if anyone found Webb? I don't know. I've been trying to find out through appropriate channels. It's slow. If you find out, I'll tell you. Natalie said. Immediately. Okay. A breath. The protocol. When does it take effect? 90 days after command signature, which is projected for next month. 90 days? Yes. Another silence. The kind that was doing something, processing, settling, making a kind of room for the outcome to be real. Okay, Osei said again. But it was a different okay than the first one. Less compression, more space. Okay, Natalie agreed. Her last week at Fort Harlow was administrative, out-processing paperwork, equipment verification, the logistical sequence of a soldier transitioning from one assignment to the next. She was returning to operational field duty, a new posting at an elevation she was already calculating wind tables for. On the second-to-last day, Prescott called her into his office. He was a man who kept his office in a different state than most officers. Minimal, organized, one photograph on the desk that she could now see was a family one, 3 kids and a woman in a yard somewhere green. He looked at her when she came in with the expression of someone who had something considered to say. "You're a difficult person to have in a working group," he said. She waited. "You're also the reason the protocol has teeth instead of suggestions." He folded his hands on the desk. "I want you to know that distinction was noted in my report to Hare." "I appreciate that, sir. I also want to say something off the record." He looked at her directly. "What was done to you and to the others on that list was a specific and sustained wrong. The inquiry documented it. The process is addressing it. But documentation and process are—" He paused. "They're the institution's way of acknowledging something. They're not the same as the acknowledgement mattering to the people it happened to." She looked at him. "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Do you think it mattered? The work we did here." She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. Not for the comfortable answer, but for the accurate one. "Ask me in 5 years," she said, "when I can see whether the protocol changed anything specific, whether the modification window actually closed, whether someone filed an assessment that would have been dismissed 3 years ago, and instead it went through the review queue and someone acted on it." She paused. "Then I'll know if it mattered." Prescott looked at her for a long moment. "Fair," he said. "That's fair." He stood and extended his hand. She shook it. "Shab." The night before she left Fort Harlow, she sat at the desk in her room with the folder in front of her and went through the contents one more time. The duty modification order from the previous posting, the 3 assessments from FOB Granite, the formal inquiry citation with her name on it, Lyle's business card, which she'd put in the folder because it was a kind of paperwork and she kept paperwork, the folded piece of paper with Yara Osei's contact information, now worn at the creases from being taken out and put back, a copy of the protocol final draft, 87 pages, her signature on page 87. She sat with all of it spread on the desk in the quiet room and looked at the shape of 3 years as a stack of documents, which was the wrong way to understand 3 years and also the only way to hold it at once. Then she put it all back in the folder and closed it and set it in the bag with everything else. The photograph of the Kentucky mountains was the last thing she packed. She held it for a moment. The specific light, the ridge line she could identify if she wanted to, the sky above it that her father had taught her to read. It had been in her kit for 3 years, and it was, she realized, not about sentiment and not about home in any simple sense. It was about knowing what terrain looked like when you'd spent enough time in it to understand it all the way down to the ground. She packed it. In the morning, she shouldered her bag and picked up the rifle case and walked out of the transitional housing building into the flat Fort Harlow dawn, which was pale and cold in the way of flat ground rather than the sharp cold of elevation, and walked to the vehicle that would take her to the airfield. The M110 case was in her right hand and the bag was on her shoulder and the folder was inside it, and she walked at her own pace across the compound and did not look back at the building. She was posted to FOB Kessler in the spring, high desert rather than mountain, different wind tables, different terrain grammar. New commanding officer, Major Delphine Okafor, who read Natalie's file before she arrived and met her at the vehicle gate on the first day and said, without ceremony, "Your assessments are operational input here. File them to me directly." That was all she said about it. It was enough. 2 months into the Kessler posting, A patrol-based assessment she'd filed about a munitions cache location resulted in a successful interdiction. 3 days later, she filed a follow-up assessment about a secondary cache network inferred from the movement patterns of the interdiction response. Okafor acted on it within 24 hours. She did not think of this as vindication. She thought of it as the work functioning the way the work was supposed to function, which was the standard she'd always held herself to, which was the same standard she'd held the system to when the system wasn't meeting it. In the fall of that year, she received a letter from a staff sergeant, Marcus Webb, who had been reached through the inquiry's remediation process, and whose letter was short and factual and said, among other things, that he'd spent 2 years after separating from the Army thinking the problem had been something in him, some failure of persistence or credibility or professional gravity, and that learning it had been systematic and documented, and that other people had experienced the same sequence had been, he used the word disorienting and then crossed it out and then wrote it again. Disorienting in a way he was still getting used to. He was working as a security consultant. He was doing all right. She wrote back the same day. She kept the letter to a page. She said what was true and useful rather than what was comforting, which was what she'd have wanted someone to say to her. She said, "The system failed you. You did your job. Those two things don't cancel each other out, and they don't have to." She sealed the letter and filed the copy and went back to work. 3 years after FOB Granite, in a different country, in a different altitude, Natalie Brooks sat at the back of a briefing room at a training installation and watched a class of junior soldiers receive instruction on the new assessment integration protocol. The instructor was young, so mid-20s, competent, explaining the modification window and the mandatory review queue with the confident efficiency of someone who had learned the rule from a document rather than from experience. He described the 48-hour response requirement and the IG notification trigger and the specific language of the review queue prioritization rubric, and none of the soldiers in the room knew where those specifications had come from or what had produced them. She didn't expect them to know. After the class, the instructor caught her in the corridor. Staff Sergeant Brooks? He'd recognized her from the name tag. "Were you involved in the—" He gestured vaguely in the direction of the protocol material he'd just taught. "Some," she said. "We covered the inquiry in our professional development course," he said. "The working group, the administrative framework that got built." He paused, looking at her with the careful curiosity of someone trying to match a person to a story they've heard. "Were you one of the, I was at FOB Granite in 2011, she said. He nodded slowly. "Does it work?" he said. "The protocol, in practice." She thought about Okafor reading her file before she arrived. She thought about Yara Ose, who was still in and was currently a sergeant first class at a posting in Italy and who called every few months. She thought about Marcus Webb's letter with disorienting crossed out and written again. "It's better than what came before it," she said. "Whether that's enough depends on who's implementing it and whether the implementation holds under pressure." He absorbed that. "So it depends on people," he said. "It always depends on people." She picked up her bag. "That's why you teach it." She walked out into the installation afternoon, which was warm and flat and smelled like cut grass and diesel fuel, and she thought about the 19-year-old version of herself that had never considered enlisting, had spent her childhood reading terrain and wind and the grammar of mountains, had sat with her father on a cold hillside in eastern Kentucky, and learned that knowing something before other people knew, it was not arrogance. It was attention, and attention was the beginning of everything. She had spent 12 years attending, to threat patterns, to terrain, to the behavior of people in rooms when they thought no one was watching, to the paperwork, to the gap between what the system said it was and what it actually was, and then to the work of making those two things closer together. It was not a complete story. It was not a resolved story, in the way that stories resolved in films, with clarity, with finality, with all accounts settled and all debts paid. Marcus Webb was doing all right. Priya Anand's complaint had gone in circles until it didn't. 3 of the 7 had pleaded and 2 were facing trial, and 2 were in jurisdictional limbo that might not resolve for years. The protocol existed and was being taught and would be stressed and tested and would probably need revision in 4 or 5 years when new edge cases surfaced that nobody had anticipated. She didn't need it to be complete. She needed it to be true. And it was. She got in the vehicle and drove toward the airfield and thought about the next posting, the new terrain, The wind tables she hadn't calculated yet, the first assessment she would file when she arrived. She would file it the same way she'd always filed them. Because the information needed to exist somewhere. Because the math was either right or it wasn't, and someone had to put it on paper, and she was the one who could. Because the work was the work, and the work didn't wait for the world to be ready for the person doing it. The strongest thing you can do in a room that doesn't want you there is to keep being exactly as good as you are. Not louder, not harder, not smaller. Just precise, documented, and patient enough to let the truth catch up to what you already know.